In the middle of Kansas, hundreds of miles from any coastline, paleontologists have pulled marine reptile bones out of the rock. Not fish, not ancient whales, reptiles built for open ocean, some of them enormous, buried in the middle of a landlocked state. Because 70 million years ago, Kansas was the bottom of a sea, a vast inland ocean cut straight through the middle of North America, stretching from what is now the Arctic down to the Gulf of Mexico. Similar seas covered huge portions of Europe and North Africa. The world's coastlines looked nothing like they do today, and inside those vanished oceans lived creatures that science is still struggling to fully make sense of. One of them had eyes nearly the size of a dinner plate, the largest eyes of any vertebrate ever found. Not a whale, not a giant squid, a reptile built to see in near total darkness at depths where almost no light reaches. One had a bite force so extreme that researchers still cannot agree on its upper size limit, because when they try to model how large it could have grown, the numbers stop behaving in ways the physics allows. One ancient shark has had its estimated body length revised so many times in the last 15 years that scientists working from different reconstruction methods still disagree by several meters on how large it actually was. And some of these animals survived the single deadliest extinction event in Earth's history, the one that wiped out roughly 96% of all marine life. And instead of being reduced by it, some of their descendants grew larger on the other side of it. None of these animals were dinosaurs. That matters, because this is not an extension of the story most people already know. This is a completely separate world, an entire ocean ecosystem that rose, dominated, and vanished, leaving behind bones that still do not fit neatly into what we understand about how large animals work. Tonight, we go into those oceans and into the creatures that filled them and find out why the deeper researchers look, the stranger the answers become. But before we do, let me know in the comments, what part of the world are you watching from, and is it day or night there right now? If you enjoy calm videos like this, please give this one a like and maybe subscribe. Now let's begin. Long before the familiar outlines of the modern world emerged from the sea, the planet carried a different arrangement of water and stone. Coastlines drifted across the globe like slow-moving shadows, continents pressed together in unstable silence, and the ocean itself behaved like a system still experimenting with what life could become. The interval now called the Mesozoic Era stretched across three immense chapters of time: the Triassic, beginning roughly 252 million years ago, the Jurassic, beginning around 201 million years ago, and the Cretaceous, which ended 66 million years ago, beneath fire, darkness, and impact. Across all three periods, one fact remained constant. The sea was not simply an older version of the ocean alive today. It was a fundamentally different world of water. At the beginning of this age, most of Earth's land existed as a single supercontinent called Pangaea. It rose across the planet like one enormous mass of dry stone, surrounded by vast interconnected seas. But the crust beneath it never rested. Over millions of years, fractures opened through the continent, and the plates beneath the surface began to pull apart with unbearable slowness. Oceans widened where none had existed before. New coastlines formed, vanished, and reformed again. The geography of the Mesozoic Ocean was determined not by modern maps, but by drifting tectonic boundaries, still rearranging the planet beneath the water. One of those vanished oceans was the Tethys Sea, a warm and shallow body of water stretching across regions that would one day become Europe, the Middle East, and Central Asia. Its waters carried extraordinary biological productivity. Coral systems expanded across broad continental shelves. Marine reptiles hunted through sunlit shallows, rich with ammonites, fish, and cephalopods. Today, the Tethys no longer exists. Its seafloor was slowly compressed upward as continents collided, folding ancient marine sediment into the mountain ranges now called the Alps and the Himalayas. Stone lifted into the sky still carries the chemical memory of an ocean long erased. The climate surrounding these waters was equally unfamiliar. During parts of the Cretaceous, sea surface temperatures near the equator likely reached between 35 and 37 degrees Celsius, warmer than modern tropical oceans. Permanent polar ice did not exist. Forests extended into regions that are now locked beneath snow and darkness for much of the year. Atmospheric carbon dioxide concentrations remain significantly higher than those of the present age, altering the chemistry of the sea itself. The water was more acidic, more chemically active, and likely more difficult for shell-forming organisms to navigate. Buoyancy, prey availability, and mineral exchange operated under conditions unlike those governing marine ecosystems today. Within this ocean, several separate lineages of predators emerged and transformed themselves into creatures that no modern sea fully resembles. Ichthyosaurs returned to the water early, before dinosaurs came to dominate the continents, reshaping reptilian bodies into streamlined hunters of the open sea. Plesiosaurs diverged into radically different forms, some carrying impossibly long necks through the water, others evolving massive skulls built for force and crushing power. Mosasaurs arrived later, descending from terrestrial lizards before spreading across the oceans with startling speed. Around them moved giant fish and ancient sharks, sharing the same warm currents beneath skies empty of birds, familiar to the modern world. None of these animals were dinosaurs. Dinosaurs belonged to a distinct terrestrial lineage, defined partly by the structure of their hips and limbs, adapted for movement on land. The reptiles of the Mesozoic ocean followed a separate evolutionary path entirely, one shaped by pressure, buoyancy, and the enormous distances of open water. And among them all, one creature emerged so anatomically strange that when its fossil first arrived in scientific hands, the skeleton appeared impossible even to the people studying it. The first scientists who examined the skeleton could not make sense of it. Bone after bone emerged from the chalk deposits of Kansas in patterns that seemed anatomically unreasonable, as though several animals had been broken apart and pressed together by accident beneath the ancient seafloor. In the year 1868, paleontologist Edward Drinker Cope received the remains of this unknown marine reptile and attempted a full reconstruction. Looking across the enormous chain of vertebrae, he placed the skull at what he believed was the front of the animal. Only later did another paleontologist, Othniel Charles Marsh, point out the mistake with devastating simplicity. Cope had attached the head to the tail. The animal was Elasmosaurus platurus, and the error surrounding it would become one of the opening blows in the bitter scientific rivalry later called the Bone Wars. Yet beneath the professional humiliation and public correction rested a quieter truth. The reconstruction failed because the proportions of the animal itself bordered on impossible. Elasmosaurus did not resemble the expectations 19th century anatomy carried into the fossil record. Its body seemed to reject ordinary balance. From nose to tail, Elasmosaurus reached roughly 14 meters in length. Nearly half of that total belonged to the neck alone. Around 7 meters of vertebrae extended outward from a comparatively compact body, carried by 4 large flippers. The neck contains 72 individual vertebrae. A human neck contains 7. No modern vertebrate possesses anything remotely comparable in proportional scale. Even among other long-necked animals across evolutionary history, Elasmosaurus remains an extreme. The structure of those vertebrae revealed something stranger still. Their joints allowed considerable side-to-side motion while restricting vertical movement. The neck could sweep through broad horizontal arcs beneath the water, curving with surprising flexibility from left to right, but it could not easily rise upward in dramatic coils above the surface. Early depictions of plesiosaurs lifting swan-like necks from the sea now appear mechanically improbable. The bones themselves resist that interpretation. This anatomical constraint created a problem that paleontology has never fully resolved. Elasmosaurus hunted fish and cephalopods in warm inland seas, crowded with fast-moving prey, yet its body does not appear built for sudden acceleration. The torso was large, the flippers powerful, but not shaped for explosive lunging, and the neck itself likely generated drag as it moved through the water. The animal existed successfully for millions of years, but the precise method by which it fed remains uncertain. One interpretation imagines Elasmosaurus approaching prey slowly from below. In this model, the body remained deeper in darker water while the narrow neck extended upward through the illuminated layers above, allowing the small head to rise gradually beneath schools of fish before striking at close range. Another hypothesis suggests the neck itself functioned almost like a living channel, woven through dense prey groups. The body remained distant and less visually threatening, while the head moved quietly among fish, reducing the chance of panic dispersal before capture. A third proposal places Elasmosaurus within underwater vegetation systems that resemble dense marine forests. There, the long neck may have threaded carefully between stems and fronds, where smaller animals gathered in protected spaces. None of these interpretations has been definitively confirmed. No fossilized stomach contents, preserved hunting scene, or direct trace of feeding behavior has settled the question. The animal continues to exist, partly within uncertainty, preserved in stone, yet still withholding the ordinary details of its daily life. And even within its own lineage, Elasmosaurus was not the furthest reach of this design. Other long-necked relatives carried additional vertebrae beyond its already astonishing count, stretching the proportions further into biological strangeness. Some fossil neck bones preserve stress fractures healed during life, evidence that certain individuals generated enough force through movement or feeding to damage their own skeletons beneath the water. Evolution in the Mesozoic ocean did not move in a straight line. Within the same ancient lineage, bodies began drifting toward opposite solutions, as though the sea itself were testing contradictory designs at once. Some plesiosaurs stretched outward into narrow forms with delicate skulls and impossibly long necks flowing through the water like living cables. Others compressed themselves into compact engines of muscle and bone, carrying enormous jaws at the front of thick bodies built for force rather than reach. Both emerged from the order known as Plesiosauria. Both shared a distant common ancestor. Yet over millions of years, they separated into radically different expressions of marine life while inhabiting the same interconnected seas. The long-necked forms belong to the plesiosaurids, smaller-headed animals whose bodies emphasized extension and maneuverability. The short-necked forms became the plesiosaurids, predators with massive skulls, shortened cervical vertebrae, and torsos built around crushing power. The difference between them was not the result of isolation across separate eras or continents. Their evolutionary paths unfolded simultaneously, side by side beneath the same warm oceans. Among the plesiosaurids, Kronosaurus queenslandicus remains one of the most imposing examples yet recovered from stone. Fossils attributed to this animal have been discovered in Australia and Colombia, regions now separated by vast distances, but once connected through the broad marine corridors of the early Cretaceous. Kronosaurus reached lengths estimated between 9 and nearly 11 meters, and much of that mass concentrated toward the skull itself. The head alone measured roughly 2.5 meters in length, a structure longer than many modern automobiles, lined with thick conical teeth designed not for slicing flesh into clean sections, but for puncturing, gripping, and crushing. The shape of those teeth reveals something quiet about the world it inhabited. Serrated blades tend to belong to predators, targeting soft tissue with rapid cutting motions. Kronosaurus carried smoother crowns, rounded and powerful, suggesting prey capable of resisting impact through shell, armor, or dense skeletal structure. Fossil stomach contents from related Plesiosaur species have included fish, cephalopods, and the remains of other marine reptiles, indicating feeding behavior that resisted simple classification. These were not delicate specialists, bound tightly to one ecological role. They appear instead as opportunistic apex hunters, moving through ecosystems already crowded with large predators. That ecological structure remains difficult to reconcile mathematically. Modern marine systems rarely sustain numerous giant predators occupying overlapping niches at the same time and place, yet parts of the Mesozoic Ocean seem to have done exactly that. Plesiosaurs large enough to attack other marine reptiles existed alongside equally massive competitors, all drawing energy from food webs shaped by warmer seas and extraordinary biological productivity. The fossil record preserves the result without fully revealing the mechanics that supported it. The geographic spread of Kronosaurus deepens the uncertainty. Closely related remains from Queensland and the Paja Formation of Colombia imply movement across immense stretches of open water, thousands of kilometers apart. Whether these animals migrated seasonally, maintained wide territorial ranges, or evolved parallel populations connected through shifting seaways remains unresolved. The oceanic geography of the Cretaceous was fluid enough that coastlines drifted while these predators still lived, altering migration pathways over evolutionary time. Another plesiosaur entered public imagination through a different route entirely. Liopleurodon became widely known after a documentary reconstruction depicted it as an animal reaching roughly 25 meters in length, enormous enough to eclipse nearly every marine predator before or since. Later scientific reassessment reduced those estimates substantially, placing most specimens closer to 6 or 7 meters long, yet the larger image persisted in popular culture with remarkable durability. In some sense, Liopleurodon now exists in two parallel forms, one preserved in the measured proportions of fossil evidence, the other carried through collective imagination, shaped by television, memory, and repetition. Beneath both interpretations remain the same fundamental anatomy. 4 large flippers move these animals through the sea without the aid of a strong tail fin, their bodies balanced between lift, drag, and momentum, in ways paleontologists still struggle to model with complete confidence. Seen from above in open water, a plesiosaur would likely have appeared almost motionless at first glance, its body suspended beneath the surface with the slow composure of something perfectly adapted to the sea. Yet beneath that calm outline, 4 large flippers were moving through the water in patterns that modern science still struggles to fully reconstruct. Unlike fish, these reptiles did not drive themselves forward with sweeping tails. Unlike crocodiles, they did not propel themselves through side-to-side undulation. Their movement came entirely from four paddle-shaped limbs descended from the walking legs of distant terrestrial ancestors. This body plan has become one of the most persistent mechanical puzzles in marine paleontology. Each flipper generated turbulence as it pushed against the surrounding water. When all four moved together, the wake produced by one limb interfered with the flow around another, creating what fluid dynamicists describe as interference drag. In simple terms, the limbs disrupted one another. The arrangement appears inefficient when compared with the cleaner propulsion systems used by modern marine animals, and yet the fossil record preserves plesiosaurs across roughly 135 million years of evolutionary success. Their bodies spread through changing oceans, surviving continental rearrangement, climatic shifts, and ecological competition on a global scale. Whatever method carried them through the sea functioned well enough to endure for a span of time almost impossible to visualize. Modern researchers have attempted to approach the problem through computational fluid dynamics, building digital models of plesiosaur anatomy, and testing how different movement patterns interact with simulated water flow. One proposed solution resembles underwater flight. In this interpretation, the front flippers generated most of the thrust through broad oscillating strokes, while the rear limbs acted mainly as stabilizers and steering surfaces. Sea turtles offer the nearest living comparison, though their rear flippers are much smaller and mechanically different. Simulations suggest this mode conserved energy effectively during steady cruising, allowing efficient travel across long marine distances. But efficiency introduced another problem. The same studies found that underwater flight alone produced relatively weak burst acceleration. A predator pursuing agile prey in open water may have required something faster and more forceful than smooth gliding strokes. This led to another model in which diagonal flipper pairs alternated movement patterns in a rhythm loosely comparable to the gait of trotting terrestrial animals, translated into water. Such motion generated stronger acceleration and greater maneuverability, but at a significantly higher energetic cost. The body consumed more power to sustain the movement, creating tension between endurance and sudden speed. Some researchers now suspect plesiosaurs shifted between multiple locomotion modes, depending on circumstance. Slow cruising, rapid pursuit, turning behavior, and vertical maneuvering may all have involved subtle changes in coordination across the four limbs. The challenge is that no modern marine vertebrate provides a direct anatomical equivalent. Sea lions rely heavily on front limb propulsion while steering with the rear. Turtles display strong asymmetry between fore and hind flippers. Penguins fly underwater using only their forelimbs. None combine four equally large propulsive paddles within a fully open ocean hunting lifestyle. Occasionally, the seafloor itself preserves brief traces of movement. Fossil trackways, shallow impressions left in ancient sediment, record moments when plesiosaurs passed near the bottom in coastal environments. These traces hint at limb placement and motion, but they remain rare and difficult to interpret with certainty. Water currents alter sediment, burial distorts shape, millions of years erase detail until only fragments remain. The bones preserve another kind of evidence. Shoulder girdles and hip structures in many plesiosaur specimens contain unusually large muscle attachment regions, indicating substantial power throughout the torso. These animals were not weak swimmers drifting passively through warm inland seas. Their limbs anchored dense musculature capable of sustained force, but strength alone does not reveal coordination. The skeleton records the engine without preserving the exact rhythm of movement. So the image remains incomplete. Four flippers moved through ancient water in combinations that no living animal now repeats, carrying bodies that persisted across geological ages with extraordinary success. while the precise mechanics of that motion continue to slip quietly beyond full certainty. Far out beyond the shallow inland seas, where coastlines dissolved into open water and the continental shelves fell away into deeper blue, another lineage of marine reptiles had already arrived at a radically different solution to ocean life. Their bodies no longer resembled creatures that once walked on land, limbs narrowed into fins, torsos tightened into streamlined forms, the neck shortened, the skull lengthened, and the outline cutting through the water began to resemble something strangely familiar to modern eyes. Around 250 million years ago, shortly after the Great Permian Extinction reshaped life across the planet, certain reptiles returned to the sea and gradually transformed into animals, now called ichthyosaurs. Over millions of years, natural selection refined their anatomy toward a body plan so similar to modern dolphins that early scientific debates questioned whether the resemblance reflected shared ancestry. It did not. Dolphins descend from mammals that re-entered marine environments roughly 50 million years ago. Ichthyosaurs emerged from an entirely separate reptilian lineage nearly 200 million years earlier. Between them stretched an immense gulf of evolutionary separation, yet both arrived at remarkably similar forms. The convergence reveals something fundamental about life in open water. When an air-breathing vertebrate evolves for sustained speed and efficient hunting across large marine distances, the possibilities narrow. Water imposes strict physical demands. Drag punishes unnecessary structure. Energy favors streamlined movement. Across unrelated branches of evolutionary history, biology repeatedly approaches the same general answer. Yet, beneath the superficial similarity, ichthyosaurs retained details that revealed their separate origins. Their tails moved vertically, beating up and down through the water in a motion more closely aligned with fish than with whales or dolphins, whose tails move horizontally. For much of scientific history, the precise shape of the ichthyosaur tail remained uncertain because skeletons alone preserved only the supporting vertebrae. Then, during the 1990s, exceptionally preserved specimens from the Holzmaden shale deposits in Germany retained outlines of soft tissue around the tail itself. The fossils revealed crescent-shaped flukes built around a downward bend in the spine, confirming a propulsion system hidden for over a century inside the stone. The same deposits preserved another intimate detail of ichthyosaur life. Several specimens contained unborn young, still positioned inside the body cavity, evidence that these reptiles no longer returned to land for reproduction. They gave birth at sea. One remarkable fossil captured the moment of delivery itself, a juvenile emerging tail, first from the birth canal. Modern cetaceans use the same orientation to reduce the risk of drowning during birth by keeping the head inside the mother until the final stage of emergence. Across hundreds of millions of years and entirely unrelated evolutionary paths, the same marine constraint produced the same biological solution. Some ichthyosaurs reached extraordinary size. The largest widely accepted species, Shonosaurus sicaniensis from what is now British Columbia, measured roughly 21 meters in length. Fragmentary bones, re-examined in 2018, suggested the possibility of even larger individuals approaching 25 or 26 meters. Dimensions that would rival or potentially exceed the blue whale itself. The evidence remains incomplete, and scientific consensus has not settled around the estimate. Even so, the possibility alone expands the scale of what these reptiles may have become within the Mesozoic Ocean. Ichthyosaurs appeared before dinosaurs fully established dominance across terrestrial ecosystems. They crossed through immense stretches of geological time while continents separated and marine environments reorganized around them. For approximately 80 million years, they shared the planet with the Great Age of Dinosaurs before disappearing around 90 million years ago, long before the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous world. Their extinction remains unresolved. No single catastrophe marks the boundary of their disappearance. The fossil record suggests decline, fragmentation, and eventual absence without the clarity of sudden destruction. Somewhere within the anatomy that made ichthyosaurs such effective marine hunters, there may also have existed a hidden vulnerability, preserved now only in fragments of bone, impressions of skin, and eyes that would eventually become among the largest ever evolved by any vertebrate life. In certain ichthyosaur skulls, the eye sockets dominate the entire architecture of the head. Bone narrows around them as though the rest of the animal had been reduced simply to support vision. Even before the soft tissues vanished and the oceans that carried these reptiles disappeared into geological time, the eyes themselves had already become structures operating near the edge of biological possibility. Elasmosaurus lived during the late Jurassic, roughly 160 million years ago, moving through marine environments where sunlight weakened quickly beneath the surface. Its eyes measured close to 23 centimeters across, placing them among the largest ever evolved by any vertebrate. Another ichthyosaur, Temnodontosaurus, carried eyes estimated at approximately 26 centimeters in diameter, the largest confirmed eyes yet known in the history of animal life. For comparison, the eye of a modern blue whale measures roughly 15 centimeters. A human eye spans only a few centimeters across. In these ancient reptiles, the scale of vision expanded beyond anything still alive today. Inside each eye sat a structure called the sclerotic ring, overlapping plates of bone arranged around the eyeball like a reinforced collar. Many reptiles and birds possess smaller versions of this feature, but in large ichthyosaurs, the rings became exceptionally massive and heavily built. Their purpose appears partly structural. At great depth, water pressure presses inward against soft tissue with enormous force. The reinforced ring helped prevent the eye from deforming or collapsing under compression. The engineering preserved within these fossils implies environments far deeper than ordinary coastal hunting grounds. A study published during 2017 attempted to model the visual performance of these eyes under low light conditions. Using estimates of pupil diameter, retinal sensitivity, and optical geometry, researchers concluded that some ichthyosaurs may have been capable of detecting faint bioluminescent signals at depths where almost no surface light remained. The calculations pointed toward possible hunting behavior between 1,000 and 2,000 meters beneath the surface, within regions of the ocean approaching near total darkness. Such depths introduce severe physiological demands for any air-breathing vertebrate. Pressure increases rapidly with descent. Oxygen stores become limited. Nitrogen dissolved in body tissues can interfere with neural function under extreme compression. Modern deep-diving mammals survive these conditions through a suite of highly specialized adaptations developed across millions of years. Mussels accumulate elevated concentrations of myoglobin, a protein that stores oxygen directly within tissue. Heart rate slows dramatically during descent, conserving oxygen for the brain and essential organs. Rib cages flex inward under pressure, allowing the lungs to partially collapse in controlled ways that reduce nitrogen absorption. Whether ichthyosaurs evolved similar systems remains uncertain, though certain lines of evidence suggest the possibility. In 2018, researchers reported chemical markers in Ichthyosaur bone that may indicate elevated myoglobin concentrations associated with deep diving behavior. The findings remain debated. The sample size was limited, and the analytical methods have not yet been reproduced broadly across additional specimens. Even so, the chemistry joins a growing pattern already implied by anatomy and optical modeling. Each line of evidence points quietly in the same direction. The enormous eyes suggest adaptation for gathering faint light. The reinforced sclerotic rings imply survival under substantial pressure. The proposed biochemical signatures hint at oxygen management systems associated with extended dives. Yet none of these observations alone fully confirms the complete physiological picture. The fossils preserve fragments of a solution without preserving the living process itself. And so the image remains incomplete, suspended between evidence and uncertainty. Ichthyosaurs cross through immense spans of geological time before disappearing roughly 90 million years ago, long before the asteroid impact that ended the reign of the large marine reptiles. The environmental pressures proposed for their extinction developed gradually across changing oceans through warming waters, shifting ecosystems, and reorganized food chains. In theory, such slow transformations should have allowed adaptation across generations. Instead, one of the most successful marine reptile lineages in Earth's history slowly faded from the sea, carrying its immense eyes with it into darkness. Some extinctions leave a scar so sharp in the geological record that the boundary can be traced across the planet like a dark seam through stone. The end of the non-avian dinosaurs belongs to that category. Roughly 66 million years ago, an asteroid struck near what is now the Yucatan Peninsula, releasing energy on a scale beyond ordinary planetary events. The aftermath reshaped climate, collapsed ecosystems, and erased entire lineages in geological moments. The evidence remains preserved in shocked minerals, global iridium layers, and crater structures buried beneath younger sediment. It is one of the clearest extinction events Earth has ever recorded. The disappearance of the ichthyosaurs carries none of that clarity. They vanished roughly 90 million years ago, nearly 25 million years before the asteroid impact that ended the Cretaceous world. No confirmed global catastrophe marks the boundary of their extinction. No singular event cuts sharply across the fossil record, announcing their end. Instead, one of the most successful marine reptile lineages in Earth's history faded gradually from the oceans after surviving for more than 150 million years. For paleontologists, the problem is not the absence of possible explanations, it is the abundance of overlapping ones. One leading hypothesis centers on an environmental disruption, now called Oceanic Anoxic Event 2, a period during the late Cretaceous when enormous volcanic activity altered marine chemistry on a planetary scale. Vast eruptions released immense quantities of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, warming the oceans and changing circulation patterns within deep water systems. Warmer water retained less dissolved oxygen. In many basins, the deep ocean became depleted enough that large regions effectively transformed into underwater dead zones where complex marine life struggled to survive. The geological record preserves traces of this transformation in layers of dark, organic, rich shale deposited across multiple continents. These sediments formed in oxygen-poor environments where dead material accumulated faster than decomposition could consume it. The chemistry of entire marine ecosystems shifted, food webs reorganized. Species distributions changed alongside temperature and oxygen gradients moving through the sea. At first glance, the timing appears persuasive. Oceanic anoxic event 2 occurred approximately 93 million years ago, close to the interval during which ichthyosaurs disappeared. Yet the fossil record complicates the connection almost immediately. Ichthyosaur remains continue appearing in deposits overlapping with parts of the event itself, suggesting at least some populations survived through the environmental disruption rather than collapsing instantly beneath it. Their extinction appears stretched across several million years rather than compressed into a single catastrophic pulse. Research published during 2021 added another layer to the mystery. Analyses of ichthyosaur diversity through time suggested that species richness had already been declining long before the final disappearance. The lineage may have entered a prolonged period of weakening across multiple regions, leaving fewer forms distributed across increasingly unstable marine ecosystems. Whatever final pressure ended them may have arrived only after millions of years of gradual contraction. Another possibility emerged from the changing predator structure of the late Cretaceous seas. Around the same period that ichthyosaurs declined, the first mosasaurs began appearing in marine environments. These large predatory lizards would later spread across the oceans with extraordinary speed, eventually becoming dominant marine hunters in many ecosystems. Some researchers proposed ecological competition between the two groups, imagining mosasaurs displacing ichthyosaurs from key hunting niches or prey networks. But even this explanation resists clean resolution. The earliest mosasaurs appear after ichthyosaur diversity had already begun to diminish, making direct competitive replacement difficult to establish with certainty. The sequence suggests overlap, but not necessarily causation, and so the extinction remains suspended inside multiple interacting pressures that unfolded across the same changing ocean. Warming seas altered circulation patterns, oxygen depleted in deeper waters, food chains reorganized, predator communities shifted, marine chemistry drifted away from earlier conditions. Each factor may have weakened the lineage incrementally until the combined weight became irreversible. Or perhaps one decisive pressure still hides unnoticed within the incomplete fossil record. While the ichthyosaurs were slowly disappearing from the sea, another lineage was only beginning its expansion, arriving late in the history of the Mesozoic Ocean and spreading through it with astonishing speed, until entire marine ecosystems would eventually revolve around its presence. The rise of the mosasaurs unfolded with unusual speed, as though the ocean had suddenly opened a vacant space large enough for an entirely new kind of predator to expand into. By the time their earliest fossils appear roughly 98 million years ago, the ichthyosaurs had already vanished from the seas, and many plesiosaur lineages were declining. Across marine ecosystems destabilized by environmental change, mosasaurs entered quietly and then spread with astonishing efficiency. Within approximately 20 million years, they had become dominant predators across nearly every major ocean on Earth. In geological terms, this was an extraordinarily rapid ecological takeover. Entire marine food webs reorganized around animals that had only recently returned to the water. Unlike the reptiles that preceded them, mosasaurs were not descendants of earlier marine specialists. They emerged from lizard ancestry, closely related to modern monitor lizards and more distantly connected to snakes. Their transition into ocean life represented another independent experiment in marine evolution, separate from the ichthyosaurs and separate again from the plesiosaurs. Once more, the sea pulled a terrestrial lineage back beneath the surface and reshaped it according to the demands of open water. Their bodies retained traces of that ancestry. The torso remained long and flexible, almost serpentine in proportion, while the limbs transformed into broad paddles used for steering and stabilization. For more than a century, scientific reconstructions depicted mosasaurs with flattened tails moving through the water in eel-like motions. Then, within the last 15 years, exceptionally preserved soft tissue fossils altered the picture completely. Tissue outlines revealed crescent-shaped tail lobes forming a vertical fin more similar to the tail of a shark than to earlier interpretations. The spine curved downward into the lower lobe, creating a propulsion system specialized for fast swimming through open marine environments. The implications changed how paleontologists understood the entire lineage. Mosasaurs were not sluggish coastal ambush hunters drifting through shallow seas. Many species appear to have been highly active pelagic predators, capable of sustained pursuit across enormous distances. Among the largest was Mosasaurus hoffmanii, an animal estimated between roughly 13 and 17 meters in length. Its skull alone approached the size of a small boat, lined with backward curving teeth adapted for gripping prey once seized. Biomechanical modeling suggests bite forces potentially exceeding those calculated for Tyrannosaurus rex, though the comparison carries uncertainty because the animals occupied completely different ecological systems. Even so, the scale of force involved places Mosasaurus among the most powerful marine predators yet reconstructed from the fossil record. Another genus, Pliosaurus, is known from remarkably complete skeletons recovered from Kansas, though during the late Cretaceous, that region lay beneath the waters of the western interior Seaway. Warm marine currents once divided North America completely in half, stretching from the Arctic southward toward the Gulf of Mexico. Within that shallow inland sea, Pliosaurus moved through rich ecosystems crowded with fish, ammonites, sharks, birds, and other marine reptiles. Its elongated snout and streamlined proportions suggest an agile hunter adapted for active predation in open water. Not all mosasaurs pursued the same strategy. Globidans evolved blunt, spherical teeth specialized for crushing hard-shelled prey. The jaws resemble rows of rounded stone tools built for pressure rather than cutting. Fossil evidence strongly suggests these reptiles fed on ammonites and other shelled marine animals abundant throughout the Cretaceous ocean. Even within a single lineage, mosasaurs diversified rapidly into multiple ecological roles. Late in their history, some species reveal continued refinement toward hydrodynamic efficiency. Pliosaurus possessed a narrower body, stiffer tail region, and proportions indicating stronger adaptation for rapid swimming than many earlier relatives. Evolution had not slowed. Even near the end of the Cretaceous, mosasaurs were still changing, still adjusting their anatomy toward increasingly specialized marine performance. Then, another discovery complicated their biology further. In 2020, isotope analysis from mosasaur tooth enamel produced evidence suggesting that certain species may have maintained body temperatures above the surrounding seawater. If correct, some mosasaurs were not fully cold-blooded after all, but partially warm-blooded predators moving through ancient oceans with metabolisms more complex than anyone had previously imagined. For most of modern paleontological history, the physiology of marine reptiles seemed straightforward. Mosasaurs descended from lizards, and lizards today regulate body temperature through the environment around them. Heat arrives from sunlight, from warm stone, from surrounding air or water. Internal metabolism contributes comparatively little. By that logic, the giant reptiles of the Cretaceous seas were assumed to function in much the same way, their activity levels constrained by external temperature, like the movements of modern snakes or monitor lizards. But deep within fossilized tooth enamel, another possibility had been waiting unnoticed. During 2020, researchers published a study examining oxygen isotope ratios preserved inside mosasaur teeth. The method relied on a subtle property of biological minerals. As enamel forms inside a living body, oxygen isotopes become incorporated into the structure at ratios influenced partly by temperature. Under carefully controlled analysis, those ratios can preserve a chemical signature of body heat from millions of years earlier. Instead of inferring physiology indirectly from anatomy or behavior, the study approached the problem through chemistry produced by the animals themselves while alive. The results suggested that at least some mosasaurs maintained body temperatures several degrees above the surrounding seawater, not fully warm-blooded in the mammalian sense, but not entirely cold-blooded either. The pattern aligned more closely with regional endothermy, a physiological strategy seen today in animals such as leatherback sea turtles and certain sharks, including the great white. These animals generate and retain heat in specific parts of the body, allowing muscles and internal organs to function at temperatures higher than the surrounding water. For mosasaurs, this possibility changes the entire ecological picture. An animal capable of maintaining elevated internal temperature gains important advantages in marine environments. Muscle performance becomes more stable across cooler waters. Reaction speed improves. Sustained swimming requires less dependence on external heat. Geographic range expands because colder regions no longer impose the same physiological limitations. In the late Cretaceous ocean, such adaptations may have allowed some mosasaurs to remain active across marine habitats inaccessible to fully ectothermic competitors. Yet the advantages carried costs. Warmer tissues require greater metabolic output, and greater metabolism demands more energy. A partly endothermic mosasaur would have needed substantially more food than a reptile operating entirely at ambient seawater temperature. Predatory behavior, hunting frequency, and prey selection all become linked to the energy requirements imposed by internal heat generation. The oceans supporting these reptiles may have contained food webs rich enough to sustain such demands on enormous scales. The study itself revealed another layer of complexity. Not every mosasaur species displayed identical isotope patterns. Some specimens suggested stronger temperature regulation than others. This variation implies that regional endothermy may not have characterized the entire lineage uniformly. Different mosasaurs may have occupied different physiological categories altogether, despite sharing broad anatomical similarities. One genus may have relied heavily on external warmth, while another maintained elevated muscle temperatures during long-distance pursuit. The marine reptiles of the Cretaceous may have been metabolically more diverse than their skeletons alone first suggested. Modern oceans offer partial parallels. Great white sharks maintain internal warmth through a network of closely arranged blood vessels called a rete mirabile, a countercurrent heat exchange system that conserves metabolic heat generated by swimming muscles. Warm blood traveling outward transfers heat into colder blood, returning inward, reducing thermal loss to the surrounding water. No direct evidence for such a structure has yet been identified in mosasaurs, but soft tissue preservation rarely survives deeply enough to confirm or exclude the possibility with certainty. So, the physiology of these animals remains suspended between chemistry and absence, between isotope signatures preserved in enamel and anatomical systems erased by time. The old image of mosasaurs as simple giant lizards drifting through warm seas no longer fits comfortably with the evidence emerging from their own fossilized tissues. And once the possibility of elevated metabolism enters the picture, another question follows naturally behind it. A predator maintaining warmth inside its body across open marine environments would have required immense and continuous energy. Somewhere within the Cretaceous ocean existed prey abundant enough to sustain entire populations of such hunters, animals so numerous that their shells would one day accumulate into layers of stone thick enough to form cliffs. Across the floor of the Cretaceous ocean, shells accumulated in numbers so immense that entire landscapes of the future would eventually be built from their remains. Layer upon layer settled through the water column after death, drifting downward in slow spirals until they vanished into marine sediment. Millions of years later, those compressed remains would harden into chalk cliffs, limestone beds, and fossil-rich stone stretching across continents. Long before becoming geology, they belonged to animals called Ammonites. Ammonites were cephalopod mollusks, distant relatives of the modern nautilus, squid, and octopus. Soft, tentacled bodies emerged from tightly coiled external shells, divided internally into chambers that helped regulate buoyancy within the water. Their lineage first appeared roughly 400 million years ago, long before the rise of marine reptiles, and survived through repeated planetary catastrophes that erased countless other forms of life. They crossed through the Permian extinction, the Triassic restructuring of ecosystems, and additional extinction pulses that transformed the ocean again and again. During the Mesozoic, Ammonites diversified into thousands of species, occupying marine environments across the globe. Some remained only a few centimeters wide, drifting through shallow waters in delicate spirals scarcely larger than a hand. Others grew to astonishing dimensions. One giant species, Parapuzotia sepenredensis, discovered in Germany, reached shell diameters approaching the height of a tall human. Its coiled shell expanded outward in broad whorls, thick enough to survive burial and compression across tens of millions of years. Their abundance made them central to nearly every marine ecosystem surrounding the giant predators of the age. Fossil shells preserve punctures and fractures matching the bite patterns of mosasaurs, large fish, and pliosaurs. Some shells contain repaired injuries, where the animal survived an earlier attack and continued growing afterward, adding new layers over damaged chambers, like scars preserved in mineral form. In life, Ammonites likely drifted, swam, or hovered through vast numbers across the warm seas, becoming one of the primary food sources sustaining the immense predatory biomass of the Cretaceous ocean. They also became one of the most useful tools in paleontology itself. Ammonite species evolved rapidly, often persisting for less than 1 million years before changing into new forms. Because their shells fossilized so readily and spread across broad marine regions, geologists learned to use them as chronological markers embedded within rock layers. The presence of a specific ammonite species can identify the relative age of sediment with remarkable precision. In many ways, the chronology of the Mesozoic ocean has been assembled through the repeated appearance and disappearance of their shells in stone. Yet for all their resilience, Ammonites ultimately encountered a boundary they could not survive. At the end of the Cretaceous, roughly 66 million years ago, they disappeared completely alongside the giant marine reptiles and the non-avian dinosaurs. This extinction remains deeply puzzling because their close relatives, the nautilids, survived the same catastrophe and still move through modern oceans today. Two broadly similar cephalopod lineages occupied the same seas under the same collapsing environmental conditions, yet one vanished entirely while the other endured. Researchers have proposed several possible explanations. Differences in shell geometry may have influenced buoyancy or survivability during ecological collapse. Depth preferences may have sheltered nautilids from the most severe disruptions affecting surface ecosystems, but the leading hypothesis focuses on reproduction. Ammonite larvae appear to have spent their earliest life stages drifting near the ocean's surface as tiny planktonic organisms, dependent on stable food webs powered by sunlight and phytoplankton productivity. Nautilid young, by contrast, hatch as relatively developed miniature versions of adults, bypassing the vulnerable planktonic phase entirely. When the end Cretaceous impact disrupted marine photosynthesis and destabilized surface ecosystems, that developmental difference may have become decisive. Yet even this explanation remains incomplete. Fossils preserve shells, not behavior. The final days of ammonite reproduction remain hidden behind extinction itself. Still, for hundreds of millions of years before that boundary arrived, the oceans carried ammonites in numbers almost beyond comprehension, enough to sustain predators across every level of the marine food chain, including one enormous, fast-moving fish whose bones were initially mistaken for those of a reptile from the ancient sea. The waters of the western interior Seaway did not belong only to reptiles. Beneath the surface moved enormous fish shaped by speed, pressure, and pursuit, their bodies cutting through warm marine currents that once divided North America from north to south. Among them was Xiphactinus audax, a predator built with such exaggerated proportions that the first fossil discoveries were mistaken for marine reptiles rather than fish. Xiphactinus reached lengths of roughly 6 meters, its body resembling an immense scaled-up tarpon armed with a deeply forked tail, an upward-angled jaw, and long fang-like teeth designed not for slicing prey apart, but for gripping it securely once seized. The skull tapered into a narrow predatory profile, adapted for rapid strikes through open water. Unlike the mosasaurs and plesiosaurs surrounding it, Xiphactinus was not a reptile at all. It belonged to the teleosts, the same vast lineage that today includes salmon, tuna, mackerel, and nearly half of all living vertebrate species on Earth. That connection matters because teleost fish would ultimately outlast nearly every giant predator of the Mesozoic seas. Even while marine reptiles dominated the Cretaceous oceans, the lineage that produced modern fish diversity was already ancient and thriving beneath them. The body of Xiphactinus suggests a lifestyle built around speed. Its narrow form, powerful tail, and streamlined proportions resemble modern pelagic predators capable of rapid acceleration through open water. Some estimates place its burst swimming speeds above 50 kilometers per hour, potentially making it one of the fastest large hunters in the Cretaceous ocean. In life, it likely surged through schools of fish with sudden explosive movement, overtaking prey before escape became possible. One fossil specimen, preserved in Kansas, captured a moment from that world with extraordinary clarity. Housed today at the Sternberg Museum of Natural History, the skeleton belongs to a Xiphactinus measuring approximately 4 meters in length. Inside its ribcage rests another fish almost half its size, a species called Gylicus arcuatus, preserved nearly intact from head to tail within the predator's body cavity. The smaller fish shows almost no sign of external damage, no shredded flesh, no broken sections, no clear evidence of dismemberment before swallowing. It appears to have been consumed whole and head first while still alive. The position of the skeleton suggests the prey remained largely intact inside the stomach after ingestion, occupying so much internal space that the outline of one animal became visible inside the other. Something then went catastrophically wrong. Damage to the ribs and surrounding skeletal structure of the Xiphactinus indicates substantial internal trauma. Paleontologists have proposed that the struggling prey may have injured the predator after being swallowed, rupturing tissue or damaging internal organs badly enough to cause death shortly afterward. The fossil preserves not only the final meal, but perhaps the final mistake of the animal itself. Yet the fossil record cannot reveal whether this behavior represented ordinary feeding strategy or exceptional overreach. Large modern predatory fish often swallow prey whole, especially when rapid consumption reduces the chance of losing food to competitors. It is possible Xiphactinus regularly consumed prey approaching astonishing proportions relative to its own body size. It is equally possible this particular event was unusual, a catastrophic attempt that exceeded physiological limits. Fossils preserve singular moments with perfect stillness while remaining almost silent about frequency. Xiphactinus disappeared alongside much of the Cretaceous marine world at the boundary 66 million years ago, but the broader teleost lineage survived. In the aftermath of extinction, those surviving fish diversified into rivers, reefs, lakes, polar seas, abyssal depths, and nearly every aquatic habitat now existing on Earth. More than 30,000 teleost species live today, descendants of an evolutionary branch already ancient when Xiphactinus hunted through the inland sea. Even so, within its own ecosystem, Xiphactinus occupied only part of the predatory hierarchy. The waters it crossed also held marine reptiles vastly larger than itself, hunters whose jaws generated bite forces so extreme that modern paleontology still struggles to place them within the upper limits of vertebrate biomechanics. Far above the Arctic Circle, where dark mountains rise from frozen water and the wind moves across exposed stone with almost no interruption, layers of Jurassic seafloor rest inside the cliffs of Svalbard. For most of human history, those rocks remained untouched, holding the compressed remains of an ocean predator that would not be recognized until the early years of the 21st century. In 2006, paleontologists excavating the islands uncovered a massive Pliosaur skeleton from rock dating to roughly 147 million years ago, and almost immediately the animal began reshaping assumptions about how large marine predators could become. Before formal scientific description, the specimen acquired a dramatic nickname among researchers and journalists alike, Predator X. The name lingered because the animal itself seemed to resist ordinary scale. Early estimates suggested a total body length between 13 and 15 meters, with a bite force calculation approaching 33,000 pounds per square inch. For comparison, the bite force of a modern saltwater crocodile reaches roughly 3,700 pounds per square inch, while estimates for a great white shark remain near 4,000. The numbers placed the Svalbard predator in a category almost disconnected from living analogs. When formally described several years later, the animal received the scientific name Pliosaurus funke. Some later analyses argued for smaller estimates, placing the creature closer to 10 or 13 meters based on revised skull-to-body scaling ratios. Yet, even the more conservative interpretations preserved the same central fact. This was still among the largest pliosaurs ever discovered, an animal built around immense crushing force concentrated into an enormous head. The skull alone measured close to 2 meters in length. Teeth extended up to 30 centimeters, conical and thick, shaped less like blades and more like polished spikes of bone. Unlike the serrated teeth of some terrestrial predators, pliosaur teeth were designed to puncture, grip, and shatter. A strike from such jaws would have delivered catastrophic pressure into flesh and bone alike, particularly against other marine reptiles sharing the same waters. Svalbard itself added another layer to the mystery. The archipelago has produced multiple giant pliosaur specimens within relatively close proximity, preserved across ancient seabed deposits now lifted into polar rock. Researchers have proposed several explanations for this concentration. The region may once have been a preferred hunting corridor rich in prey. It may have served as a breeding or congregation area connected to seasonal migration routes. It is also possible the pattern reflects unusual preservation conditions rather than true biological clustering. The fossil record preserves outcomes without always preserving causes. The discoveries did not stop there. Along the Jurassic coast of Dorset in southern England, another enormous pliosaur skull emerged from the cliff face in 2023, after erosion exposed bone hidden within the rock. The skull measured roughly 2 meters in length and belonged to an animal that excavators described as potentially the largest pliosaur yet discovered. At the time of its announcement, formal peer-reviewed estimates remained unfinished, leaving the upper size boundary unresolved once again. That pattern has repeated itself for decades. Each new major pliosaur discovery arrives not as confirmation of established limits, but as a challenge to them. The maximum size expands, contracts, then expands again as new specimens emerge from coastlines, quarries, and Arctic sediments. Paleontology continues to revise the scale of these predators because the fossil record itself remains incomplete. Vast intervals of ocean history survive only in fragments, and each fragment has the potential to redraw the outline of what once lived beneath the surface. All of these creatures moved through seas that were not stable worlds, but shifting systems shaped by forces rising from beneath the crust itself. Deep below the seafloor, volcanic provinces periodically released immense quantities of carbon into the atmosphere and ocean, warming marine waters and disrupting oxygen circulation across entire basins. In some intervals, enormous regions of the deep ocean lost so much oxygen that the seafloor became nearly uninhabitable, transforming entire hemispheres of marine life from below, while giant predators still crossed the surface waters above them. Far beneath the warm surface waters of the Cretaceous Ocean, entire regions slowly lost the ability to sustain complex life. The change did not arrive as a sudden catastrophe visible from the shoreline. It unfolded gradually through chemistry, circulation, and heat, spreading downward through the water column until vast portions of the deep ocean carried almost no oxygen at all. These intervals are now known as Oceanic anoxic events, periods when the sea itself became chemically hostile across enormous areas of the planet. The mechanism began far from the creatures swimming above. Across parts of the ancient world, immense volcanic eruptions poured carbon dioxide into the atmosphere over extended spans of geological time. One of the largest volcanic systems responsible lay within what is now associated with the Caribbean Large Igneous Province, where magma rose through the crust on a scale difficult to imagine in the modern world. The atmosphere warmed, the ocean absorbed that heat, and warm water, unlike cold water, cannot retain dissolved oxygen with the same efficiency. As oxygen concentrations declined in deep marine environments, the biological structure of the seafloor began to change. In oxygen-rich conditions, organic matter sinking from above is consumed by bacteria that break it down through ordinary respiration. But within oxygen-starved water, different microbial communities emerged. Sulfur metabolizing bacteria expanded into regions where oxygen had vanished, producing hydrogen sulfide as a metabolic byproduct. The compound is highly toxic to most complex organisms, turning portions of the deep ocean into chemically dangerous environments where survival became increasingly difficult. Among these events, the interval now called Oceanic Anoxic Event 2 stands as the most severe known from the Cretaceous. Occurring roughly 93 million years ago, its signature appears across rock formations separated by oceans and continents alike. In Europe, North Africa, and North America, geologists find the same dark, carbon-rich layer preserved within marine sediment, a global horizon recording a synchronized transformation of ocean chemistry. The layer appears not as ordinary stone, but as black shale dense with compressed organic material. Those black deposits are not simply geological curiosities. They are the compacted remains of vast biological accumulation. Billions of organisms settling through oxygen-depleted water onto seafloors where decomposition slowed dramatically or stopped altogether. In normal marine settings, dead material is consumed and recycled. During anoxic intervals, much of it remained preserved within sediment instead. Over millions of years, pressure and heat transformed portions of those deposits into petroleum source rock. Some modern fuel reserves ultimately trace their carbon back to these intervals of ancient marine death. Yet the ocean during these events contained a strange contradiction. While deep waters became depleted and hostile, evidence suggests that productivity near the surface may actually have intensified in some regions. Nutrient cycling altered by volcanic activity and changing circulation patterns appears to have fueled enormous blooms of plankton in sunlit waters above. The result was an ocean divided vertically into radically different worlds. Near the surface, life flourished in extraordinary abundance. Far below, darkness and oxygen deprivation spread across the seabed. Large marine reptiles continued appearing in fossil deposits associated with these intervals, suggesting that at least some populations survived by remaining within oxygenated upper waters. But survival near the surface did not guarantee ecological stability. Prey distributions shifted as deep water ecosystems collapsed, food webs reorganized. Migration patterns likely changed with temperature and chemistry alike. Predators crossing the open ocean would have inhabited environments whose visible calm concealed profound chemical instability beneath them. The volcanic activity driving these transformations reshaped more than local ecosystems. It altered atmospheric composition, ocean circulation, and planetary climate on scales extending across millions of square kilometers. The same greenhouse conditions that destabilized deep marine oxygen levels also contributed to the unusual warmth and productivity of the Mesozoic seas themselves. In that altered ocean, supported by elevated carbon dioxide and immense biological output, multiple predator lineages reached sizes unmatched in later eras, growing within a planetary system fundamentally different from the oceans known today. In the modern ocean, the largest animals belong mostly to a single lineage. Whales dominate the upper boundary of marine size, while most other predators remain far smaller by comparison. The Mesozoic seas follow different rules. Across the same span of geological time, Multiple unrelated lineages independently expanded toward gigantism at once, as though the ocean itself repeatedly encouraged size beyond ordinary limits. Ichthyosaurs reached lengths exceeding 21 meters, with some disputed estimates extending even further. Pliosaurs grew into compact predators between 13 and 15 meters long, armed with skulls massive enough to overpower other apex hunters. Mosasaurs expanded through the late Cretaceous into elongated marine lizards, reaching roughly 13 to 17 meters. Even fish, such as Xiphoctinus, approached 6 meters in length while sharing the same waters. These animals did not descend from a common giant ancestor. They emerged from separate evolutionary histories, arrived at different anatomical solutions, and yet all converged toward unusual scale within the same planetary ocean. That convergence has become one of the deepest unresolved questions in marine paleontology. One traditional ecological principle, called Bergmann's rule, suggests that larger body sizes are favored in colder climates because bigger animals retain heat more efficiently. But the Mesozoic ocean was not colder than the present world. It was substantially warmer. Tropical surface waters reached temperatures exceeding many modern seas, while polar regions lacked permanent ice. The pattern appears inverted relative to what conventional ecological expectations would predict. Some researchers focus instead on productivity. Elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide and warmer global temperatures may have stimulated immense blooms of phytoplankton across portions of the ocean. Increased plankton supports larger zooplankton populations, which in turn support greater numbers of fish, cephalopods, and marine reptiles. In this view, the Mesozoic ocean operated with an unusually high energy budget. More energy entered the food web at its base, and that surplus cascaded upward through every trophic level, eventually supporting predators of exceptional scale. Yet, this explanation remains incomplete. Local abundance alone does not fully explain why gigantism appeared repeatedly across unrelated predator groups simultaneously. Productive environments exist in modern oceans as well, but they do not consistently generate multiple independent lineages of giant marine hunters occupying overlapping ecological roles at the same time. Another hypothesis examines oxygen. Atmospheric oxygen concentrations fluctuated throughout the Mesozoic, and oxygen availability influences the metabolic ceilings of living organisms. Some scientists propose that altered oxygen dynamics may have allowed marine animals to sustain larger body sizes than would otherwise be possible, but seawater responds differently to atmospheric oxygen than air does. Dissolved oxygen levels depend on circulation, temperature, and chemistry in ways more complicated than terrestrial environments. The relationship between oxygen and marine gigantism therefore remains uncertain, suggestive without becoming definitive. There is also the possibility that gigantism emerged because the early Mesozoic ocean had been ecologically emptied by catastrophe. After the Permian extinction eliminated the overwhelming majority of marine species, enormous ecological space remained open. Entire predator guilds vanished, food webs fragmented. In such an environment, evolutionary experimentation accelerated across surviving lineages. Once large size evolved within any predator group, the advantages could reinforce themselves. Large predators face fewer natural threats, gain access to broader prey ranges, and can travel farther through open ocean systems. Even so, no single explanation fully resolves the pattern. The current scientific view is increasingly multi-causal. Temperature, productivity, oxygen availability, ecological opportunity, evolutionary feedback, and sheer geological duration may all have contributed simultaneously. The Mesozoic ocean persisted under relatively stable greenhouse conditions for immense spans of time, allowing lineages to continue refining large body strategies across millions upon millions of years. Still, the most unsettling part of the question may lie beyond the fossil record itself. Nearly every giant marine reptile known today comes from shallow inland seas, coastal shelves, and environments favorable to fossil preservation. The deep ocean floor of the Mesozoic has largely vanished through tectonic recycling beneath Earth's crust. Whatever lived in those abyssal waters left almost no recoverable trace. The known giants, therefore, exist within a record already incomplete from the beginning. Beneath the warm surface seas crossed by pliosaurs and mosasaurs stretch deeper environments that paleontology can barely access at all, regions where size limits may have extended far beyond the boundaries preserved in stone. Most of the creatures described so far were discovered in places that were once shallow seas. Inland waterways, coastal shelves, quiet sediment basins, and regions where mud accumulated gently across the sea floor became the archives from which paleontology reconstructs the Mesozoic ocean. Bones settled there. Burial occurred rapidly enough to slow decomposition, and mineral-rich sediment gradually replaced organic structure with stone. The ancient marine world survives because certain environments preserved it long enough for continents to lift those sediments back into daylight. The deep ocean followed different rules. Almost none of the true Mesozoic deep sea floor still exists on Earth today. Oceanic crust is temporary on geological timescales. It forms along spreading ridges, drifts slowly outward, then eventually descends beneath continental plates through subduction. At those tectonic boundaries, entire sections of seabed are pulled downward into the mantle and melted back into the interior of the planet. The average lifespan of an oceanic plate is roughly 200 million years before destruction. Since the Mesozoic oceans existed across spans approaching that same duration, the overwhelming majority of their deep seafloor has already vanished completely. That disappearance creates a profound blind spot in marine paleontology. Every food web reconstruction, every predator hierarchy, every estimate of maximum body size rests overwhelmingly on fossils recovered from shallow marine environments. Coastal sediments preserve life well because they accumulate continuously and remain attached to continents long enough to survive geological recycling. Deep ocean ecosystems leave almost no equivalent record behind. Statistically, this means the fossil record is systematically biased from the beginning. The animals preserved most clearly are the ones living nearest to environments favorable for fossilization. Whatever inhabited the abyssal depths of the Mesozoic ocean remains almost entirely absent from direct evidence. Paleontologists can infer possibilities, model ecosystems, and compare with modern analogs, but the actual organisms themselves may have disappeared without leaving recognizable traces. The modern ocean offers a revealing comparison. For most of scientific history, the giant squid existed as rumor, fragment, and indirect evidence. Sailors described impossible tentacled animals dragging at ships. Scientists recovered isolated arms from beaches and fragments from whale stomach contents. Yet, despite living in the same world as industrial nations, submarines, and global shipping routes, the first photograph of a living giant squid in its natural habitat was not captured until 2004. Even then, another species remained more elusive still. The colossal squid, larger and heavier than the giant squid, was not examined in a reasonably complete specimen until 2007. Both animals had existed alongside humanity for all of recorded history, while remaining effectively invisible within the deep ocean. That reality changes the scale of uncertainty surrounding the Mesozoic Sea. If modern deep water can conceal animals of extraordinary size into the 21st century, despite satellites, sonar, and global exploration, then the abyssal environments of the Mesozoic may have held entire faunas beyond anything preserved in the fossil record. Those oceans were warmer than today, biologically productive across immense spans, and persisted for roughly 180 million years. Evolution operated there continuously across intervals longer than the time separating Tyrannosaurus from the present day. The honest boundary of the science emerges quietly from that realization. Statements about the largest marine animal ever discovered, or the apex predator of the Mesozoic Sea, are accurate only within the surviving shallow water record. They are not complete statements about the ocean itself. The actual upper limits of Mesozoic marine life may never be fully recoverable because the environments most likely to conceal unknown giants are the environments least likely to preserve them. Even the shallow water record remains incomplete. New discoveries continue appearing from regions barely studied a generation ago. Arctic islands, African coastlines, inland deserts, and eroding cliffs still produce specimens that alter established assumptions about size, diversity, and distribution. Entire marine ecosystems remain represented by only fragments, waiting within rock layers that have only recently begun to receive sustained scientific attention. A fossil can remain buried for 100 million years and still alter scientific understanding within a single afternoon. That is part of what makes the study of Mesozoic marine life feel unfinished. The ancient ocean is not a completed archive waiting quietly in museum drawers. It is an active and shifting field where new discoveries continue to overturn assumptions that once appeared stable, sometimes with startling speed. In 2018, paleontologists re-examined fragmentary bones from British Columbia that had rested in collections for decades. Earlier studies identified the remains simply as belonging to a large ichthyosaur, but renewed analysis suggested something far more extreme, an animal potentially exceeding 25 meters in length. If correct, the estimate would place the specimen beyond even the blue whale in total size. The proposal remains under formal study and continues to generate debate, yet the existence of such disagreement reveals something important on its own. Even the upper size boundary of the Mesozoic Ocean is still not firmly settled. Around the same period, another long-standing mystery finally shifted after more than a century of uncertainty. Tanystropheus, a strange Triassic reptile with an enormously elongated neck, had puzzled paleontologists since its discovery. Some researchers believed it lived mostly on land. Others argued for an aquatic lifestyle. The skeleton alone could not fully resolve the debate. Then, in 2020, researchers combined high-resolution computed tomography, scanning with oxygen isotope analysis, examining internal anatomy and chemical signatures hidden inside the fossil itself. The results indicated that Tanystropheus was semi-aquatic and likely hunted fish along shallow coastlines and lagoon margins. A question lingering since the 19th century was answered using tools unimaginable to the scientists who first described the animal. That same year brought another transformation in understanding. Chemical isotope studies of Mosasaur tooth enamel revealed evidence consistent with partial warm-bloodedness, overturning assumptions that had persisted since mosasaurs entered scientific literature during the 18th century. The discovery emerged not from dramatic new skeletons, but from chemistry preserved invisibly inside fossilized tissue. Ancient bones had begun yielding information beyond shape alone. In 2021, researchers formally described a mosasaur species from Angola, Ankylosaurus bocage, recovered from a region historically underrepresented in marine paleontology. The discovery suggested that entire ecosystems from the Cretaceous Ocean may still remain undocumented simply because extensive fieldwork has not yet occurred in many parts of the world. The fossil record often reflects where researchers have searched most intensively, not necessarily where ancient biodiversity was greatest. Then, in 2022, a Pliosaur specimen from Russia preserved traces of soft tissue texture, an exceptionally rare form of preservation for large marine reptiles. Skin impressions and surface details survive only under extraordinary burial conditions, making such fossils almost singular windows into how these animals physically appeared in life. Most pliosaurs are known only through bone. This specimen carried hints of the outer body itself. Along the Jurassic coast of Dorset, erosion exposed another enormous pliosaur skull in 2023, potentially representing the largest specimen of its kind yet discovered. Formal scientific analysis remains ongoing, and once again the known scale of these predators may expand further. Behind all of these discoveries stands a rapidly changing set of analytical tools. Synchrotron X-ray imaging can reveal microscopic structures invisible even to conventional computed tomography scans. Stable isotope geochemistry reconstructs body temperature, migration, and diet through chemical signatures locked inside enamel and bone. Ancient protein analysis has begun recovering fragments of peptide sequences from fossils more than 80 million years old. Machine learning systems now examine enormous fossil datasets, identifying statistical patterns too subtle for individual researchers to detect unaided. These technologies are not simply refining old conclusions. They are creating entirely new categories of questions. Questions earlier generations of paleontologists could not even formulate because the evidence itself remained inaccessible. And yet, despite all this expanding precision, one boundary persists quietly beneath the entire field. The fossil record can preserve anatomy, chemistry, and occasionally fragments of soft tissue, but the complete living reality of the Mesozoic Ocean still remains partly beyond recovery, hidden within behaviors, ecosystems, and vanished depths that stone alone may never fully reveal. A skeleton is only the architecture of a living thing. The motion of muscle beneath skin, the texture of tissue against seawater, the pulse of blood through organs adapted for immense pressure, these almost never survive the passage into stone. In the study of Mesozoic marine life, soft tissue remains the hardest boundary, the permanent blind spot around which nearly every reconstruction must carefully navigate. Most fossils preserve only the most durable structures: bone, teeth, occasionally shell. Everything softer disappears long before burial can protect it from decay. Muscles collapse, skin ruptures, organs dissolve into sediment and bacterial films. By the time mineralization begins, the living animal has already been reduced to a sparse framework. Paleontologists are often reconstructing entire ecosystems from what amounts to structural residue. Very rarely, conditions align with extraordinary precision. Burial occurs rapidly in oxygen-poor sediment, where scavengers cannot easily disturb the remains. Water chemistry slows decomposition. Fine mineral particles settle gently enough to preserve impressions too delicate for ordinary fossilization. These rare deposits are called Lagerstätten, a German term meaning storage place, and they function almost like geological interruptions in the normal destruction of biological detail. Among the most important of these sites is the Holzmaden Shale of Germany. There, Jurassic ichthyosaurs were preserved with outlines of soft tissue still visible around the skeleton. These fossils revealed dorsal fins and crescent-shaped tail flukes that earlier scientists had never imagined correctly. For decades, ichthyosaurs had been reconstructed with flattened tails resembling oversized reptiles paddling through water. The preserved tissue showed something closer to the hydrodynamic profile of fast pelagic hunters. Entire visual interpretations of the animals changed because a handful of specimens retained impressions measured in millimeters. Yet these fossils are statistical anomalies. The overwhelming majority of marine reptile discoveries contain no such information at all. A mosasaur skeleton may preserve every vertebra and still reveal almost nothing about the texture of its skin, the thickness of its musculature, or the shape of the soft tissue extending beyond the bone itself. Even body outlines are usually absent. Color remains almost entirely unknown. In 2014, researchers reported traces of melanin structures from an ichthyosaur specimen, suggesting dark dorsal coloration and lighter ventral surfaces, a pattern called countershading. Many modern marine predators use similar coloration because light descending from above makes darker backs difficult to distinguish from deep water, while lighter undersides blend against the illuminated surface when viewed from below. The result hinted at a familiar visual ecology stretching across hundreds of millions of years. Yet molecular preservation at this scale remains methodologically difficult, and conclusions drawn from isolated specimens must remain cautious. The same silence surrounds sound itself. Whether ichthyosaurs vocalized underwater, whether mosasaurs communicated acoustically across distance, whether plesiosaurs detected prey through low-frequency vibrations, none of this can be answered directly. Inner ear structures in some ichthyosaurs suggest effective underwater hearing, but bone can reveal only the receiving anatomy, not whether the animal generated sound in return. Migration and breeding behavior disappear even more completely. Fossils rarely preserve seasonal movement. They do not easily record whether juveniles traveled with adults, whether certain coastlines functioned as nurseries, or whether marine reptiles gathered in vast temporary congregations during reproductive periods. Modern whales leave migratory signatures through direct observation and tagging. Mesozoic reptiles left almost none. This creates a quiet asymmetry at the center of paleontology. The questions humans most naturally ask about extinct animals, how they behaved, communicated, hunted, interacted, and moved through their world, are precisely the questions the fossil record is least capable of preserving. Bones reveal structure with remarkable clarity, but structure alone cannot fully contain life. And yet, from time to time, behavior does leave a mark, not through preserved muscle or skin, but through trauma, a fractured rib that healed crookedly, bite marks carved into vertebrae, teeth broken during combat, and fused back into the jaw. In those injuries, the ocean briefly records interaction itself, a direct physical memory of animals colliding with prey, rivals, and survival inside waters now vanished from the earth. Long after muscle and skin vanish into sediment, bone continues carrying small records of violence. A healed fracture, a puncture sealed by new growth, a vertebra warped under repeated stress. These are moments where extinct behavior becomes briefly visible. Fossil pathologies, preserved injuries and diseases within ancient skeletons, are among the most intimate forms of evidence available to paleontology because they document not merely anatomy, but survival. An injury that healed tells two stories simultaneously. First, something powerful enough to damage the animal occurred. Second, the animal endured it long enough for bone to begin repairing itself. The fossil therefore captures both conflict and resilience together, a biological memory written directly into the skeleton. Among the clearest examples come from mosasaurs. Specimens of both Tylosaurus and Mosasaurus preserve healed bite marks whose spacing and geometry match the teeth of their own species. The wounds do not resemble random scavenging damage added after death. Bone regrowth surrounds the injuries, confirming the attacks happened during life. In several cases, the bites cluster around the skull and jaw, areas commonly targeted during dominance conflicts among living reptiles and marine mammals. Paleontologists interpret these traces as evidence of intraspecific combat, struggles over territory, mates, or hierarchy unfolding within the warm inland seas of the late Cretaceous. One remarkable Tylosaurus specimen from what is now South Dakota carries a different kind of damage. The front of the snout shows dense, healed trauma consistent with repeated blunt force impacts rather than tooth penetration. Its elongated rostrum was heavily reinforced, structurally capable of absorbing enormous stress. Some researchers have proposed behavior loosely analogous to the head ramming documented in modern sperm whales, where impact itself becomes a weapon. The interpretation remains cautious, since behavior cannot be fossilized directly, yet the pattern of injury suggests force applied again and again across the animal's life. Elsewhere in the ocean, Plesiosaurs preserved evidence of strain within the very structure of their extraordinary necks. Certain vertebrae contain stress fractures that healed during life, microscopic damage patterns consistent with repeated mechanical overload. These injuries connect quietly to the unresolved feeding debate surrounding long-necked species discussed earlier. If the neck swept rapidly through water during hunting strikes, the forces generated by acceleration and resistance may have pushed bone close to structural limits. The skeleton records not a single dramatic injury, but accumulated stress from motion repeated thousands of times across years of predation. Predation itself appears throughout the fossil record as intersecting signatures of tooth and bone. Shark bite marks, scar mosasaur vertebrae, mosasaur teeth carved grooves into plesiosaur skeletons, pliosaur bites punctured ichthyosaur ribs and skulls. Each mark functions almost like a brief sentence from an ecosystem otherwise lost, confirming direct interaction between predators that once shared the same water. Sometimes the attacked animal survived long enough for healing to begin. Sometimes the damage remained sharp and unhealed, evidence of the final encounter. A particularly revealing Tylosaurus specimen preserved stomach contents representing 4 entirely different prey animals at once. Inside the abdominal cavity, researchers identified the remains of a juvenile mosasaur, a large teleost fish, a flightless marine bird, and a shark. The discovery confirmed extraordinary dietary flexibility. Rather than specializing narrowly, at least some large mosasaurs hunted opportunistically across multiple ecological layers of the ocean. The stomach became a compressed map of the surrounding food web. These fossils transform the Mesozoic Sea from static reconstruction into living interaction. Bones no longer appear as isolated museum objects arranged beneath soft lighting, but as remains of animals colliding, feeding, competing, surviving, and failing within a crowded ocean shaped by constant biological pressure. Yet even the worst injuries inflicted by predator upon predator remained local events, individual struggles, measured in teeth and bone. Far beyond the horizon of those ancient seas, another force was already moving through space, carrying destruction on a planetary scale that no skeleton, no metabolism, and no ecosystem could ultimately withstand. A thin layer of clay separates two worlds. In outcrops across the Earth, from North America to Europe to New Zealand, paleontologists can place a fingertip against the final boundary of the Cretaceous Ocean. Below it lies a planet filled with Ammonites, mosasaurs, Plesiosaurs, and the warm inland seas that carried them. Above it, the ecosystem changes abruptly. Entire lineages vanish into silence within a geological instant. The object responsible struck what is now the Yucatan Peninsula approximately 66.043 million years ago. Radiometric dating of minerals formed during the impact constrains the event within roughly 32,000 years, an uncertainty so narrow that in geological terms it approaches exactness. The asteroid itself measured somewhere between 10 and 15 kilometers across, large enough that the atmosphere provided almost no resistance before collision. It did not strike ordinary rock. Beneath the shallow sea covering the region lay carbonate sediments and sulfur-rich deposits accumulated across immense spans of Earth history. When the impactor hit, the crust vaporized outward with explosive force. Billions of tons of sulfur compounds, carbon dioxide, molten debris, and pulverized stone surged upward into the stratosphere within minutes. Near the impact zone, the ocean ceased behaving like water in any familiar sense. Models suggest megatsunamis rising hundreds of meters high, walls of displaced sea racing across continental margins at aircraft speed. Superheated ejecta re-entered the atmosphere across entire hemispheres, radiating thermal energy intense enough to ignite vegetation far from the crater itself. Around the Gulf of Mexico, coastal ecosystems disappeared almost immediately beneath heat, shockwaves, and moving water. Yet the deepest biological consequences unfolded more slowly through darkness rather than explosion. As sulfur aerosols spread through the upper atmosphere, sunlight reaching the surface diminished sharply. Temperatures fell. Photosynthesis weakened across land and sea together. In the ocean, the collapse began with organisms too small to see directly. Phytoplankton drifting near the illuminated surface layer. These microscopic photosynthesizers formed the energetic base of nearly every marine food web. When their populations crashed across weeks and months, the disruption propagated upward through the ecosystem in sequence. Animals dependent on plankton suffered first. Ammonites, whose young began life as tiny floating larvae within the surface waters, disappeared entirely at the boundary. Their reproductive strategy had carried them through multiple earlier mass extinctions, including the Permian catastrophe that destroyed most marine species on Earth. This time it failed. Nautilids, close relatives sharing the same ocean, survived instead. Their juveniles hatched as comparatively developed animals, bypassing the vulnerable planktonic stage altogether. Higher predators endured briefly as the food web beneath them unraveled. Mosasaurs, already sustaining large bodies and elevated metabolic demands within a shrinking ecosystem, vanished apparently within tens of thousands of years after the impact. In paleontological terms, this was almost instantaneous. Plesiosaurs disappeared alongside them. The ichthyosaurs, once among the most successful marine reptiles ever to evolve, had already been gone for millions of years before the asteroid arrived. Not everything died. Sharks persisted, as they had through every previous mass extinction known in the fossil record. Their survival appears tied to a combination of traits repeated across deep evolutionary time: dietary flexibility, wide thermal tolerance, slower metabolic requirements during scarcity, and the ability to exploit disrupted ecosystems rather than depend upon stable ones. While giant marine reptiles vanished, sharks endured by remaining adaptable inside ecological collapse. The ocean that emerged afterward was not merely emptied and refilled. Its structure had changed fundamentally. The great reptilian lineages never returned. The inland seas withdrew. Marine ecosystems reorganized around different evolutionary pressures and different survivors. Mammals would eventually move back into the water, but they entered a transformed world, colder, chemically altered, and biologically reshaped by extinction. And because of that transformation, no living ocean contains anything quite like the creatures that once crossed the vanished seas of the Mesozoic Earth. For millions of years after the end of the Cretaceous, the ocean carried an absence where entire ecosystems had once existed. The waters still moved through continental shelves and deep basins, currents still circled the planet, plankton still bloomed beneath sunlight, yet the structure of marine life had changed profoundly. The great reptilian predators were gone, and the ecological spaces they once occupied did not refill immediately. Empty niches remained open across geological spans longer than the entire history of humanity. The post-extinction world was cooler than the greenhouse oceans that preceded it. Polar ice eventually returned. Ocean circulation altered. Atmospheric chemistry shifted away from the elevated carbon dioxide concentrations that had characterized much of the Mesozoic. Productivity persisted, but the energetic intensity sustaining the old marine food webs weakened. Survivors inherited the sea, not specialists adapted to the vanished conditions of the Cretaceous world. Into that altered ocean, mammals began returning roughly 50 million years ago. Their ancestors had once walked on land with weight-bearing limbs and lungs adapted entirely for air. Over evolutionary time, those bodies changed with remarkable speed. Within approximately 15 million years, early whales had already produced forms approaching the scale of the largest mosasaurs. Yet despite superficial similarities in size and marine adaptation, the physiology beneath the skin was fundamentally different. Whales are fully warm-blooded mammals with extremely high metabolic demands. Their internal temperatures remain stable regardless of surrounding water, supported by continuous food intake and complex circulatory regulation. Large body size in modern whales depends on massive and sustained energetic throughput. Baleen whales filter immense quantities of plankton and small fish. Toothed whales consume prey with extraordinary frequency. Their gigantism is inseparable from the productivity patterns of modern marine ecosystems. No air-breathing ectotherm comparable to a mosasaur or giant pliosaur has evolved since the end of the Cretaceous. Large, cold-blooded marine reptiles disappeared with the extinction event and never returned, despite tens of millions of years of subsequent evolutionary opportunity. The reasons remain unresolved, though they appear connected to the interaction between metabolic strategy, ocean productivity, and global climate. In a cooler ocean with lower background energy availability, sustaining gigantic lung-breathing ectotherms may simply no longer have been viable. The Mesozoic Sea itself appears to have operated under a fundamentally different energetic budget. Higher temperatures accelerated biological processes across many trophic levels. Elevated atmospheric carbon dioxide may have amplified marine productivity in certain regions, supporting dense food webs capable of sustaining multiple giant predator lineages simultaneously. The ocean was not merely warmer in a superficial climatic sense. It was chemically and ecologically configured in ways unlike the modern marine system. Its predator structure reflected that difference. Throughout overlapping intervals of the Mesozoic, ichthyosaurs, pliosaurs, mosasaurs, giant sharks, and enormous predatory fish coexisted across broad geographic ranges. Multiple apex predator lineages operated simultaneously at scales that today appear ecologically unusual. Modern oceans contain formidable predators, sperm whales, orcas, great white sharks, but not the same layered concentration of giant marine hunters occupying overlapping ecosystems over such immense spans of time. This was never the permanent default state of Earth's oceans. It was a particular configuration produced by a particular planet. Continental positions, greenhouse temperatures, ocean chemistry, extinction history, atmospheric composition, and evolutionary timing aligned across roughly 180 million years to create conditions that allowed those ecosystems to exist. When those conditions disappeared, the ocean reorganized into something else entirely. And perhaps the most disorienting realization is not simply that the animals vanished, but that the world sustaining them vanished as well. The inland seas evaporated into dry continents. The Tethys Ocean folded upward into mountain ranges. Entire food webs dissolved without modern equivalent. Even the chemistry of the water transformed beyond recognition. To understand the depth of that erasure requires confronting spans of time so immense that human intuition loses its ability to hold them clearly, where whole oceans can disappear completely, leaving behind only fragments of bone suspended within stone. A human life unfolds so quickly that even mountains appear permanent, coastlines seem fixed, oceans feel ancient and unchanging. Yet the fossil record carries a different sense of time entirely, one so vast that ordinary intuition struggles to remain attached to it for more than a moment before slipping back toward familiar scales. Mosasaurs ruled the global ocean for approximately 20 million years. Modern Homo sapiens, by comparison, have existed for roughly 300,000 years. The interval during which mosasaurs dominated marine ecosystems lasted about 66 times longer than the entire history of our species. Every city, language, empire, migration, invention, and memory of humanity occupies only a tiny fraction of the duration these marine reptiles persisted across Earth's seas. Ichthyosaurs stretch the scale further still. As a lineage, they survived approximately 160 million years. That means the span of ichthyosaur existence exceeded the entire interval, separating the end of the Cretaceous extinction from the modern world. More time passed while ichthyosaurs remained alive than has passed since the asteroid ended the age of dinosaurs. Even the Mesozoic Era itself resists comfortable comprehension. The Triassic, Jurassic, and Cretaceous together extended across roughly 186 million years. The time between the present day and the end of that era, 66 million years, represents less than half of the duration the Mesozoic itself occupied. From the perspective of deep geological time, the extinction that destroyed the marine reptiles occurred closer to modern humanity than to the beginning of the world those reptiles inhabited. When Elasmosaurus moved through the inland seas, the Earth already looked profoundly unfamiliar. The Rocky Mountains had not yet risen into existence. The Atlantic Ocean remained comparatively narrow, still widening as continents drifted apart from Pangaea's ancient fragmentation. No grass-covered plains or hillsides, because grasses themselves had not yet evolved. Entire ecosystems fundamental to the modern world simply did not exist. Some remnants of that vanished planet remain visible in unexpected places. The white cliffs of Dover, rising pale above the English Channel, are composed largely of compressed calcium carbonate from microscopic marine organisms that lived within the Cretaceous Sea. For millions of years, their skeletal remains drifted downward through seawater and accumulated layer upon layer across the seafloor. Burial compressed the sediment into chalk. Geological uplift raised it above the ocean. Erosion exposed it again beneath open sky. Standing beside those cliffs means standing against the preserved floor of an ancient sea. A similar transformation occurred beneath central North America. The rocks containing mosasaur skeletons in Kansas were once soft sediment settling through roughly 200 meters of warm tropical water within the western interior Seaway. Fish swam above those sediments. Ammonite shells descended slowly through the water column. Over immense spans of time, tectonic forces drained the inland sea, elevated the continent, and exposed the ancient seabed to weather and erosion. Today, those same deposits lie beneath farmland, close enough to the surface that fossils sometimes emerge near the reach of agricultural machinery. Deep time, therefore, is not merely background context surrounding these animals. It is the central reality shaping everything about them. Their strangeness does not arise solely from long necks, giant eyes, or immense teeth. It emerges from the recognition that Earth itself has occupied radically different states across its history. Continents rearrange, atmospheres transform, oceans appear and vanish. Entire evolutionary experiments dominate the planet for spans incomprehensibly longer than human civilization before disappearing almost completely. And yet, beneath all that change, certain patterns return again and again. Similar body shapes emerge from unrelated lineages separated by hundreds of millions of years. Predators converge upon the same hydrodynamic forms. Eyes enlarge in darkness, fins narrow toward efficiency. Life repeatedly discovers comparable solutions within entirely different worlds, as though the laws governing survival continue whispering the same possibilities through every ocean Earth has ever known. Far beneath the shifting surface of evolutionary history, certain forms return with an almost unsettling familiarity. Fins narrow into the same curves, jaws harden into the same crushing shapes. Eyes enlarge against darkness in nearly identical ways. Across immense distances of geological time, life repeatedly circles back toward solutions it has already discovered through entirely different ancestry. This pattern is called convergent evolution, the independent emergence of similar traits in unrelated organisms. It appears quietly throughout the history of the Mesozoic Ocean, woven through reptiles, fish, mammals, and sharks alike. Yet, when viewed together, these repetitions begin to feel less like coincidence and more like evidence of deep physical constraints, shaping what survival in the ocean can become. The clearest example remains the resemblance between ichthyosaurs and dolphins. Their shared ancestry lies unimaginably far back in vertebrate history, long before either lineage approached the sea. Ichthyosaurs emerged from reptilian ancestors approximately 250 million years ago. Dolphins descended from land mammals returning to marine life roughly 50 million years ago. Between them stretches 200 million years of separate evolution. And yet both arrived at nearly the same hydrodynamic design: streamlined torso, dorsal fin rising from the back, elongated snout, narrowed tailstock, and powerful swimming profile, optimized for rapid pursuit through open water. Even the positioning of the dorsal fin along the body converged towards similar geometry. The ocean imposed the same demands, and evolution answered with the same architecture. A comparable pattern appears in feeding structures. The Mosasaur globidans evolved rounded crushing teeth capable of breaking hard shells. Modern horn sharks, entirely unrelated and separated by vast evolutionary distance, developed nearly identical dentition for processing shelled prey. Different ancestry mattered less than the mechanical requirements imposed by ammonites, mollusks, and armored organisms resistant to slicing teeth. Bone and enamel reshaped themselves toward the same functional outcome because the problem itself allowed only limited effective solutions. The repetition continues in reproduction. Ichthyosaurs abandoned egg laying on land and evolved live birth within the ocean, a transformation preserved in fossils showing juveniles emerging tail first from the mother's body. Modern whales and dolphins, though descended from mammals rather than reptiles, arrived independently at the same reproductive necessity. Open ocean life made terrestrial nesting impossible. Viviparity became not an evolutionary luxury, but a structural requirement for permanent marine existence. Even the deep ocean produced convergent anatomy across unrelated lineages. Ophthalmosaur ichthyosaurs developed enormous reinforced eyes capable of functioning under extreme pressure and dim light conditions far below the surface. Modern sperm whales, operating within similar depths, evolved entirely different tissues and body plans, yet converged upon comparable deep diving capabilities, oxygen management strategies, and sensory specialization. Different biological material encountered the same darkness and bent toward the same broad solution. Taken together, these repeated patterns suggest something profound about evolution itself. The range of viable possibilities in marine ecosystems is not endless. Physics narrows the path. Water density, drag, oxygen exchange, pressure, heat retention, and prey movement all impose constraints so severe that unrelated organisms repeatedly discover similar answers. Evolution explores variation freely, yet reality limits which forms can persist successfully within a given environment. This does not imply design or predetermined direction. Quite the opposite. Convergence emerges because natural selection operates within hard physical boundaries. The ocean does not preserve forms out of preference or memory. It filters relentlessly. Whatever shape moves most efficiently, hunts most effectively, or survives most reliably tends to emerge again, even from completely different evolutionary starting points. The ichthyosaur vanished 90 million years ago. The dolphin now occupies part of the ecological space it once held. One lineage disappeared entirely, while another arrived much later and rediscovered similar anatomical logic from entirely different ancestry. The ocean asked the same question twice, separated by immense spans of time, and life answered with remarkably similar geometry. In that repetition, there is something larger than extinction or survival alone. Individual species vanish, entire worlds disappear. Yet certain biological forms continue returning, as though the laws governing living matter remain quietly constant beneath all the upheaval of deep time, waiting for evolution to encounter the same currents once again. At the edge of every scientific reconstruction sits a boundary where certainty dissolves into inference. Beyond that boundary, the Mesozoic ocean becomes quieter again, not because evidence disappears completely, but because the remaining fragments no longer align cleanly enough to produce definitive answers. The farther this journey has moved through vanished seas and extinct predators, the more visible those unanswered spaces have become. The title of this story has always pointed toward them. There are still questions that paleontology cannot presently resolve, not through lack of effort, nor from lack of intelligence, but because the surviving evidence itself remains incomplete. Some mysteries persist because the relevant fossils have not yet been found. Others persist because the information required may never fossilize at all. Ichthyosaurs remain among the clearest examples. Fragmentary material from British Columbia suggests individuals potentially exceeding the size of the modern blue whale, yet no confirmed complete skeleton exists at that scale. If those estimates prove correct, then an air-breathing marine reptile, likely dependent at least partly upon ectothermic physiology, achieved dimensions beyond any known marine animal alive today. The metabolic systems that could sustain such a body remain uncertain. Oxygen storage, growth rate, thermal regulation, diving endurance, prey requirements, all remain partly obscured behind incomplete anatomical evidence. Their eyes deepen the uncertainty further. Ophthalmosaur ichthyosaurs possessed reinforced ocular structures unlike almost anything else in vertebrate history. Models suggest the capability for extreme deep diving in near total darkness, yet modeling is not direct observation. Even if those depths were routinely reached, the physiological adaptations necessary to survive such pressure in a reptile remain only partially understood. Bone chemistry hints at elevated myoglobin concentrations, but the evidence remains debated and incomplete. Plesiosaurs carry a different kind of mystery. Across approximately 135 million years, they survived, diversified, hunted, migrated, and spread across the world's oceans using a body plan still not fully explained by hydrodynamic analysis. 4 large flippers moving through dense seawater should have produced destructive wake interference under certain models, yet the lineage endured longer than many entire geological systems. Whatever locomotion strategy they employed worked extraordinarily well, but the exact coordination mechanism remains unresolved. The feeding behavior of Elasmosaurus remains equally unsettled. A neck extending through half the body length appears mechanically unsuited for rapid lunging, and the vertebral structure suggests restricted vertical motion. Yet the animal clearly fed successfully for millions of years. Ambush ascent, stealth feeding through fish schools, and foraging among underwater vegetation all remain scientifically viable interpretations. None possesses decisive fossil confirmation. Then there is the disappearance of the ichthyosaurs themselves. They vanished approximately 25 million years before the asteroid impact that ended the reign of the non-avian dinosaurs. No singular catastrophe aligns neatly with their extinction. Oceanic anoxic events, climate restructuring, ecological competition, prey shifts, and long-term diversity decline all overlap across the interval. No single mechanism has emerged as definitive. Mosasaurs present the opposite puzzle. They appeared late and expanded with astonishing speed, becoming globally dominant marine predators within roughly 20 million years. Comparable ecological takeovers at such scale remain rare within the fossil record. The precise combination of anatomy, physiology, and environmental timing that enabled their rapid expansion is still being investigated. Ammonites, survivors of 4 previous mass extinctions, vanished completely at the end of the Cretaceous, while their close relatives, the nautilids, endured. Larval ecology currently provides the strongest explanation, yet even that remains a probabilistic model rather than confirmed resolution. And beneath all of these uncertainties lies the deepest absence of all, the invisible, Mesozoic deep ocean. Oceanic crust continuously disappears into the mantle through subduction, carrying ancient abyssal sediments with it. The open deep sea of the Mesozoic survives only in fragments. Entire ecosystems may have existed there without leaving recoverable evidence. None of these unknowns represent failure. They form an honest inventory of the frontier itself. Every unanswered question marks the edge of present understanding, where future discoveries, future technology, and future minds will continue searching through stone for traces of oceans that no longer exist. Long after the animals themselves vanished, after the oceans drained from inland continents and the sediments hardened into stone, another kind of ecosystem formed around their remains. It exists in laboratories filled with isotope spectrometers, inside museum storage rooms lined with drawers of vertebrae and teeth, within computer simulations running hydrodynamic models across virtual oceans. The reconstruction of the Mesozoic Sea is no longer the work of isolated fossil hunters standing alone against desert cliffs. It has become a network of disciplines converging upon the same vanished world from different directions. At the center of that work are researchers attempting to extract biological meaning from fragments left scattered across deep time. Femke Holwerda, working with colleagues connected to the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles and international field programs, has helped expand understanding of mosasaur diversity in regions historically underrepresented in marine paleontology, particularly Angola. Along the western margin of Africa, Cretaceous coastlines once supported marine ecosystems that remained comparatively understudied for decades due to limited infrastructure, political instability, and unequal distribution of scientific resources. Fossils emerging from these formations continue reshaping assumptions about how globally distributed mosasaurs truly were, and how many regional predator communities remain only partially documented. Valentine Fischer at the University of Liège has contributed extensively to the study of ichthyosaur diversity and extinction dynamics. His work examining long-term species decline before the final disappearance of ichthyosaurs complicated earlier assumptions that their extinction resulted from a sudden singular catastrophe. Instead, the fossil record began to suggest a more gradual weakening stretched across millions of years, with ecological pressure accumulating unevenly through time. Far north in the Arctic archipelago of Svalbard, the expeditions led by Jørn Hurum of the University of Oslo transformed frozen rock into one of the richest marine reptile sites on Earth. Across years of excavation under severe polar conditions, the Spitsbergen teams recovered the Pliosaur, nicknamed Predator X, along with numerous additional large marine reptile specimens. The discoveries altered perceptions of late Jurassic predator scale and demonstrated how incomplete previous assumptions about pliosaur diversity had been. Entire skeletons remained locked inside Arctic mountains, while textbooks elsewhere described the fossil record as comparatively settled. Johan Lindgren at Lund University pushed the field into even stranger territory, investigating molecular traces preserved within fossils once assumed chemically inert. His work on melanin signatures in ichthyosaur skin suggested the possibility of reconstructing coloration patterns from Mesozoic animals. Later studies examining preserved biomolecular structures inside marine reptile tissues expanded the boundary of what paleontology believed recoverable from deep time. Fossils increasingly became not only anatomical records, but potential chemical archives. The study proposing partial endothermy in mosasaurs emerged through the work of T. Lynn Harrell Jr. and collaborators, combining isotope geochemistry with comparative analysis across living reptiles and multiple mosasaur taxa, rather than relying solely upon anatomy or ecological inference. The research extracted temperature signals directly from tooth enamel chemistry, treating fossilized mineral structure as a biological thermometer carried forward through millions of years. What connects these researchers is not agreement. Their papers often challenge one another directly. Interpretations shift as new specimens emerge, analytical tools improve, or older assumptions fail under closer scrutiny. One group proposes deeper diving behavior. Another questions the physiological plausibility. One model favors hydrodynamic efficiency. Another prioritizes acceleration. Competing explanations exist simultaneously because the evidence itself remains incomplete. At the frontier of paleontology, science rarely resembles a finished portrait. It resembles revision. Hypotheses remain provisional, arguments continue across journals and conferences, and conclusions that appear stable for decades can dissolve within a single new discovery. The Mesozoic marine fossil record remains among the most actively contested scientific landscapes precisely because so much fundamental uncertainty still survives inside it. Yet, beneath every disagreement rests the same quiet confrontation with time. These researchers spend their lives reconstructing oceans that vanished tens of millions of years before humans existed, recovering traces of organisms no living eye has ever seen. The work itself becomes something almost improbable, a species made of recent primates sitting beneath artificial laboratory light, attempting to understand predators that hunted through seas erased before the first grass ever grew on Earth. Most fossils do not emerge dramatically from untouched stone beneath the careful brush of an archaeologist. They appear quietly, almost accidentally, at the exact moment erosion decides to reveal them. A fragment of vertebra exposed after heavy rain. A curve of enamel visible in a plowed field. A dark shape protruding from a cliff face that thousands of people may have already passed without noticing. The act of fossil hunting is less about discovering hidden objects than recognizing significance inside ordinary rock before weather and time erase it again. Mesozoic marine reptile bones are continuously being destroyed. Wind, freeze, thaw cycles, waves, rivers, agricultural machinery, and gravity wear exposed fossils apart with relentless efficiency. Once a skeleton reaches the surface, its survival window narrows dramatically. Months may matter, sometimes weeks. Occasionally, only days separate discovery from permanent loss. This creates the central reality of paleontological fieldwork. Success depends not merely on knowledge, but on presence. Researchers and fossil hunters must arrive during the brief interval when a specimen is visible enough to identify, yet intact enough to recover. Across the central United States, the Niobrara Formation stretches beneath farmland and open terrain once submerged beneath the western interior Seaway. These chalk-rich sediments preserve mosasaurs, plesiosaurs, sharks, ammonites, and enormous predatory fish from the late Cretaceous ocean. Farmers in Kansas encounter fossil material often enough during plowing that the Kansas Geological Survey maintains reporting procedures for significant finds. The ancient seabed lies so close beneath the modern landscape that agricultural equipment occasionally cuts directly through marine reptile bones deposited tens of millions of years before human agriculture existed. Along the Jurassic coast of Dorset and Somerset in southern England, coastal erosion performs excavation continuously. Storms collapse cliff sections into the sea. Winter rain weakens sediment layers. Fossils emerge year-round from rock, exposed only temporarily before tides and weather destroy them. The large Pliosaur skull, discovered during 2023, had not remained hidden because the coastline was unexplored. Countless people had already walked past the same cliff. The skull simply had not yet emerged from the stone. Geological timing, rather than human absence, controlled its appearance. Far to the north, the islands of Svalbard preserve another vanished ocean beneath Arctic conditions. Jurassic and Cretaceous seafloor sediments now sit exposed at the surface through uplift and erosion, accessible only through difficult logistics, extreme weather, and expensive long-term excavation programs. The Norwegian teams working there return repeatedly because the environment continues producing marine reptile material unlike almost anything found elsewhere. Each season of melting ice and fractured rock reveals new sections of ancient seabed. In Morocco, the Kemkem beds represent one of the richest Cretaceous fossil regions on Earth, but also one of the most scientifically complicated. Commercial fossil trade supports local economies, and specimens are often excavated for sale before formal documentation occurs. Fossils separated from their geological context lose critical information. The precise rock layer, surrounding sediment, associated organisms, and depositional environment frequently contain more scientific value than the isolated bone itself. A tooth without context can identify an animal. A tooth preserved within its original geological setting can help reconstruct an ecosystem. At the edge of Antarctica, fragments of another marine world remain locked beneath ice and exposed coastal rock. Fossils recovered there already suggest distinct southern faunas adapted to polar environments during warmer periods of the Cretaceous. Yet most of the continent's sedimentary record remains inaccessible beneath kilometers of ice sheet. Beyond practical excavation with current technology, every fossil recovered from these places carries the same strange condition. None were meant to survive. No marine reptile intended to leave evidence for distant primates to uncover millions of years later. Preservation required an improbable sequence of burial, chemistry, pressure, tectonic survival, exposure, recognition, and recovery. Failure at any stage would erase the record completely. And yet, fragments endure. A vertebra weathering from stone, a tooth protruding through chalk, a skull emerging from an Arctic cliff after 150 million years of darkness. Paleontology becomes the act of intercepting those fragments before they vanish again, reading incomplete messages sent forward through deep time by organisms that never knew the future existed. At certain points in the fossil record, an entire form of life simply stops. The rocks continue upward through time, sediment layer after sediment layer, but the animals themselves never appear again. No reduced populations linger in isolated habitats. No diminished descendants survive quietly into the present. The line ends completely, as though a language vanished with every speaker at once. That is what happened to the great marine reptiles of the Mesozoic Ocean. Mosasaurs disappeared. Plesiosaurs disappeared. Ichthyosaurs disappeared long before them. None left living descendants. No modern animal carries their lineage forward through direct ancestry. Their evolutionary histories terminate inside stone. This distinguishes them from the non-avian dinosaurs whose extinction reshaped terrestrial life at the end of the Cretaceous. Birds survived. More than 10,000 avian species now inhabit the Earth, carrying dinosaur anatomy into forests, coastlines, and cities across the modern world. Feathers, hollow bones, and air sac breathing systems remain active expressions of that ancient lineage. The marine reptiles left nothing comparable. Their disappearance was total. Yet extinction is not absence alone. It is information preserved in negative form, encoded not through survival but through termination. The ending of a lineage records the limits of adaptation, the fragility of ecological structures, and the specific conditions under which entire biological systems fail. Fossils do not merely describe what life once achieved, they also describe what life could not endure. The Mesozoic Ocean supported simultaneous apex predators across multiple unrelated lineages: ichthyosaurs, pliosaurs, mosasaurs, giant predatory fish, enormous sharks. Warm seas rich in productivity sustained food webs dense enough to support large bodies and overlapping predatory niches across global oceans. That structure persisted for millions upon millions of years. Then the conditions sustaining it disappeared. The western interior Seaway drained from the center of North America. The Tethys Sea closed as continental plates converged and lifted mountain chains toward the sky. Ocean chemistry cooled, circulation patterns shifted, atmospheric composition changed, and the energetic structure that once supported marine gigantism transformed permanently. The physical ocean itself became something else. This distinction matters. The Mesozoic marine ecosystem did not collapse into the modern ocean as a damaged remnant. It vanished and was replaced by a fundamentally different system operating under different constraints. The organisms that dominate marine environments today emerged from that new reality rather than inheriting the old one intact. Whales evolved under cooler oceans and mammalian metabolism. Dolphins inherited ecological space once occupied by ichthyosaurs, yet reached it through entirely different ancestry and physiology. Seals adapted to coastlines shaped long after the inland seas disappeared. Penguins evolved as marine birds within polar systems that did not yet exist during most of the Mesozoic. Teleost fish diversified into tens of thousands of species across oceans whose chemistry and temperature no longer resembled the seas of the late Cretaceous. None of these organisms represent lesser replacements for what came before. They are not echoes of a lost golden age. They are the outcomes produced by another set of planetary conditions, another arrangement of continents, climate, ocean circulation, and biological opportunity. The Mesozoic Ocean was not the natural default state of Earth. It was one extraordinary configuration among many possible versions of the planet. That realization changes the meaning of extinction. These vanished reptiles were not removed from a stable, eternal world. The world itself changed around them until the conditions supporting their existence no longer remained available anywhere on Earth. Deep time reveals this repeatedly. Oceans reorganize, continents separate and collide, atmospheric chemistry shifts, entire ecological structures appear, flourish, and disappear. No arrangement lasts permanently, no matter how dominant it once seemed. The fossil record preserves those transitions with unsettling clarity. Each extinction boundary becomes less a story about death alone and more a record of planetary transformation, evidence that life on Earth is inseparable from the changing physical systems surrounding it. The marine reptiles vanished because the ocean that produced them vanished first. And within that realization sits another quieter implication. The rocks preserving those extinctions are also preserving the beginning of another record entirely, one still being written now, layer by layer, within the living ocean surrounding the modern world. Far below the surface of the modern ocean, sediment is settling through darkness at a speed too slow for human perception. Fragments of shell drift downward beside volcanic dust. Grains of eroded mountain stone, microscopic plankton skeletons, and the remains of animals that died hundreds or thousands of kilometers away. Layer by layer, the seafloor is recording the present era in exactly the same quiet manner that ancient seas once recorded the worlds of mosasaurs and Ammonites. The process has never stopped. The rock record is still being written. When a whale dies in the open ocean, its body descends slowly into the deep sea and settles onto the seafloor as an island of sudden abundance. Sharks arrive first, then scavenging fish, then dense communities of worms, crustaceans, and bacteria feeding from a single carcass for years or even decades. These whale-fall ecosystems are temporary, but their remains accumulate within sediment all the same. Bones become buried, minerals replace organic tissue. Pressure slowly compresses the surrounding layers. Somewhere far in the future, a fraction of those skeletons may fossilize, and a fraction of those fossils may survive tectonic recycling long enough to be discovered. The same selective process that obscured most of the Mesozoic ocean is shaping the record of the present. Coastal environments preserve differently from abyssal plains. Hard bones preserve more readily than soft tissue. Large organisms leave more visible traces than microscopic ones, despite microscopic life governing much of the ocean's chemistry and productivity. The future fossil record of the modern ocean will not be a perfect archive. It will be fragmented, biased, and incomplete, just as the ancient record is now. Yet some signals of the present age are likely to endure with startling clarity. Plastic particles have already spread through the ocean water column, shoreline sediments, polar ice, and abyssal mud. Synthetic polymers are becoming part of the geological substrate itself. Over immense spans of time, these materials may compress into a recognizable horizon within future rock layers, a chemical signature unlike anything produced by earlier biological systems. In the same way, the thin iridium-rich boundary marks the end of the Cretaceous world. The present era may leave behind a globally recognizable layer defined partly by synthetic material. Meanwhile, the ocean itself is changing again. Temperatures across many marine regions are rising at rates unusual within much of the Cenozoic record. Species distributions are shifting toward colder latitudes. Coral reef systems are reorganizing under altered chemistry. Oxygen minimum zones in certain regions are expanding. Currents, food webs, and seasonal cycles are adjusting to new thermal conditions. None of this is outside the history of Earth. The geological record documents repeated oceanic reorganizations across hundreds of millions of years, sometimes gradual, sometimes abrupt. Paleontology does not prescribe what societies should do with that information. Its role is narrower and stranger. It documents what happened before. It reveals that oceans are not fixed systems but dynamic planetary structures that have repeatedly transformed under changing climate, chemistry, tectonics, and biology. Every marine ecosystem exists within conditions that are temporary on geological timescales. The prehistoric oceans described throughout this journey were once as immediate and ordinary to their inhabitants as the modern ocean feels now. Ichthyosaurs hunted through seas that no longer exist. Ammonites drifted through food webs that vanished completely. Entire coastlines, climates, and circulation systems disappeared and were replaced by others operating under different rules. Seen from that perspective, the unanswered questions surrounding prehistoric marine reptiles begin to feel less like isolated scientific mysteries and more like reminders of a deeper limitation. Every era inherits only fragments of the worlds that came before it. Knowledge moves through erosion, preservation, accident, and survival. The fossil record is not a complete memory of Earth. It is what remained after time removed almost everything else. And somewhere beneath the modern ocean, inside sediments still soft and undisturbed, the first faint layers of another future mystery are already settling into place. A fossil begins as interruption. A shell settles where sediment is accumulating. A skeleton falls into mud before scavengers can fully scatter it. Minerals move through buried bone over immense spans of time, replacing living structure atom by atom until biology becomes geology. Then the planet folds, uplifts, fractures, erodes, and exposes the buried remnant to light again. Long after the animal itself has vanished, someone kneels beside an outcrop and notices that the curve emerging from the stone is too regular to be random. Everything described throughout this journey began that way. A vertebra recognized in a cliff face, a tooth weathering from shale, a ring of bone traced through compressed sediment and identified as the support structure of an eye larger than any living animal possesses today. Every fact in paleontology begins not with certainty, but with recognition. Someone sees structure where others see only rock, and yet the record being reconstructed is incomplete at every level. The fossil archive is not a preserved world waiting to be opened intact. It is fragmented, distorted, and unevenly distributed across geography and time. Entire environments vanished without preserving much at all. Soft tissue almost always decays. Deep ocean ecosystems disappear into tectonic recycling. Predator behavior, migration, color, vocalization, social structure, and sensory experience survive only in scattered, indirect traces. Paleontology does not retrieve the past whole. It infers the past from what endured destruction long enough to become visible again. This condition does not weaken the science, it defines it. Every conclusion rests on available evidence interpreted through methods that continue to evolve. A body length estimate changes when new scaling relationships are developed. A feeding hypothesis shifts when stress analysis reveals new mechanical constraints. Chemical techniques unavailable one decade become standard the next. Even familiar statements carry silent qualifications beneath them. What researchers mean by certainty is not permanence, but the strongest explanation currently supported by surviving evidence. That is why the unanswered questions matter so deeply. The eye of Temnodontosaurus, more than 26 centimeters across, still exists as mineralized structure inside stone that was once seafloor mud. The bony reinforcement surrounding it implies pressure conditions far below ordinary surface waters. Light-gathering models suggest hunting in near darkness. We possess the architecture of the organ itself, but the actual image that I perceived has vanished completely. No fossil preserves sight. The neck of Elasmosaurus still extends through the rock record in an improbable chain of vertebrae, each segment articulating with the next across a structure longer than most living cars. Biomechanical modeling constrains how it may have moved through water. Feeding strategies can be proposed, rejected, revised, and tested again. Yet the precise rhythm of that motion, the instant of a successful strike through a late Cretaceous sea, remains outside recovery. The jaws of Pliosaurus funke preserve enough geometry for bite force calculations, exceeding any measured living predator. Teeth the length of a human forearm still emerge from Arctic sediments after 140 million years. The force can be estimated, the musculature can be reconstructed, but the encounter itself is gone. The collision between predator and prey survives only as implication. What remains across all of these animals is fragmentary and astonishing at the same time. Bone, tooth, isotope ratio, compressed carbon trace, a scar healed across a rib, an outline preserved in shale. These remnants are incomplete, yet from them emerges an entire vanished ocean, partially visible through inference and persistence. And perhaps that is the deeper meaning of the record itself. The ancient sea cannot be fully recovered, but it continues generating inquiry long after the organisms that inhabited it disappeared. In that sense, the prehistoric ocean is not entirely gone. Its surviving fragments still shape thought, still reorganize understanding, still pull living minds toward questions large enough to outlast certainty itself. Night settles over the modern ocean exactly as it settled over the Mesozoic Sea. Currents continue moving through darkness. Sediment continues falling through water column after water column, grain beside grain, shell beside shell, carrying the remains of living systems toward burial. Nothing in that process remembers mosasaurs or ichthyosaurs. Nothing in it pauses for extinction. The ocean records without reflection, and yet the record remains. The questions carried through this journey are not invented mysteries shaped for drama. They are unresolved scientific problems being studied right now across laboratories, museums, and excavation sites around the world. Researchers still debate how giant ichthyosaurs supported bodies potentially larger than modern whales. They still debate how plesiosaurs coordinated 4 massive flippers with enough efficiency to dominate the sea for more than 100 million years. They still debate the meaning of the enormous reinforced eyes of deep-diving ichthyosaurs, the extinction sequence that removed entire lineages before the asteroid ever arrived, the hidden ecology of deep water environments that left almost no fossil trace behind. But when all those uncertainties are placed together, a larger realization begins to emerge. For approximately 180 million years, the ocean contained ecosystems unlike anything alive today. Multiple giant predator lineages evolved independently inside the same planetary system. Some gave live birth in open water, some crossed entire oceans, some hunted in darkness at depths modern reptiles cannot survive. Some developed body plans so specialized that no equivalent has evolved again since their disappearance. Then the conditions supporting that world changed, and the world itself ended. Not gradually into familiarity, but completely. The Mesozoic Ocean was not merely an extension of the dinosaur age on land. It was its own complete biological reality, operating beside forests of sauropods and tyrannosaurs, while following evolutionary pathways entirely separate from them. Beneath the surface, another planet seemed to exist, populated by reptiles shaped like fish, lizards transformed into sea hunters, coiled cephalopods drifting in impossible abundance, and predator guilds, dense enough to support multiple giants in the same waters at the same time. Now most of that ocean survives only as residue. The white cliffs of Dover are compressed seafloor. Black shale deposits are compacted remains of vanished marine ecosystems. Mosasaur vertebrae weather from Kansas farmland because a tropical inland sea once occupied the center of North America. Every fossil recovered from these environments is part biological remnant, part geological accident, and still the ocean continued. The Permian extinction erased nearly all marine life, yet the sea rebuilt itself into something new. The Triassic restructuring ended entire lineages, and new ones emerged into the vacant systems left behind. The asteroid at the end of the Cretaceous eliminated the great marine reptiles, and the oceans reorganized again around different survivors. The lesson carried through deep time is not that specific creatures endure forever. Nothing in the record suggests permanence. What persists is the process itself, the continual reshaping of life under changing planetary conditions. Even now, the deep ocean remains largely unseen. Vast sections of seafloor are still unexplored. Sediment accumulates there at rates so slow they resist ordinary imagination, millimeters across spans longer than civilizations. Inside those layers, the present world is already becoming geology. Whale bones settle into darkness. Microplastics descend beside plankton shells. Chemical traces of industrial civilization spread into future stone. The ocean keeps all of it. One day, in a time beyond any human horizon, some fragment of the present age may surface again through uplift and erosion. Another intelligence may study the remains the way modern paleontologists study the Mesozoic Sea, reconstructing vanished ecosystems from scattered traces while knowing most of the original world is gone forever. What they will understand cannot be known. What matters is that the record continues. So now, take a deep breath, let your shoulders loosen. The ocean is still writing,